If you were born in a world where your future was decided somewhere between your first breath and your first pair of hand-me-down shoes, becoming a servant in a manor wasn't so much a choice as it was a practical acceptance of reality. In rural communities, opportunities didn't exactly fall from the sky, unless you counted bird droppings, which technically did fall but never improved your financial situation. Most families lived on land they didn't own, harvested crops they didn't profit from, and prayed the weather would behave for once. So when a manor offered steady food, a roof, and work that didn't depend on whether the clouds felt petty that season, it looked almost luxurious. Almost. Hello, travellers! Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. For many young people, stepping into service was the closest thing to social mobility available. Think of it as the medieval, early modern version of getting an entry-level job, except your entry level involved hauling buckets of water at 5 a.m. and smiling through it. Parents encouraged it because sending a child to serve meant one less mouth to feed, and possibly one more set of wages coming back home. Some families sent multiple children partly for survival and partly because it was the cultural norm. If your older sister became a maid, guess what? Congratulations, you were probably next. Family tradition worked like an inheritance. Except instead of land or wealth, it passed down chores. There was also the undeniable appeal of predictability. Farm life was wild. You could starve because it rained too much, or because it didn't rain at all, or because someone sneezed near the wheat and the entire village blamed witchcraft. Manor service, for all its misery, was at least consistent. Your work wouldn't be ruined by a hailstorm, only by the housekeeper's glare, which somehow felt just as destructive. Stability was a treasure, even if the treasure came with blisters and a never-ending to-do list. The good news? You have a job. The bad news? It starts before the sun remembers it exists. And then there were the social perks, or what pastors perks. Young servants lived in bustling communities where gossip moved faster than the master's horse. People married in service, made lifelong friendships, and occasionally caught the attention of higher-ranking staff who could help them rise. In a world without social media, your workplace was your social network, and you spent every waking moment in it. Privacy was a myth reserved for the wealthy and for people who lived alone in forests, and even they probably had squirrels judging them. Religion and immorality also shaped expectations. A respectable household was seen as a proper place for a young person to learn discipline, which is a polite way of saying that someone else would teach them how to scrub, polish, sweep, sew and obey without talking back. Churches praised service as honourable work, the kind that built character, even if that character came with calloused hands and early onset exhaustion. Many believed working under a strict master prepared you for life's challenges. And if it didn't, at least it prepared you to fold linens with military precision. Another reason people entered service was the lure of rare opportunities beyond the village. A manor wasn't just a workplace, it was a window into a world most commoners never interacted with. You saw fine clothing you'd never wear, meals you'd never taste, and luxuries you'd never touch unless cleaning them. An ambitious servant could learn etiquette, literacy, or specialised skills like cooking, skills that could open doors elsewhere. Not many doors, to be fair, but at least more than zero. And in an era without upward mobility, slightly elevated sideways mobility felt like winning. But perhaps the biggest motivator was simply survival. Harsh winters, failing harvests, or the death of a family member could push anyone into service. The manor became a safety net, albeit one made of rough wool and unrealistic expectations. Life was precarious, and a position in a household offered some protection. You wouldn't get rich, but you likely wouldn't starve. You would, however, develop a lifelong hatred of stairs. Becoming a servant wasn't glamorous. It wasn't even moderately pleasant, but it was a path carved by necessity, custom, and the faint hope of something better. Whether you dreamed of a stable income, escaping a crowded cottage, or simply not spending your life staring at potatoes, service offered an alternative. Not freedom, not fortune, but structure. And in a world of chaos, structure had its own strange allure. Even if that structure involved making beds you'd never sleep in and polishing things no one actually looked at. Before you even touched a broom, polished a banister, or accidentally bowed to a coat rack because you thought it was the master, it happens, your entire existence in the manor was already decided by one thing, your rank. The hierarchy wasn't just a system, it was a sacred, unwritten constitution enforced with raised eyebrows, tightly pressed lips, and the occasional terrifying throat clear from someone above you. You didn't simply work in a manor. You existed inside a living pyramid where each layer carried its own expectations, privileges, and unspoken threats. Congratulations, you're at the bottom. Gravity works in social systems too. At the top of this internal kingdom stood the butler, the calm, controlled overlord of all things polished, poured, and perfectly timed. His footsteps were soft, but his authority echoed through every hallway. He dictated where footmen stood, how wine was stored, and which servant dared breathe near the silverware. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. One quiet look from him could stop a footman mid-stride, mid-sentence, and sometimes mid-heartbeat. His domain was the dining room, the silver vault, and the master's personal presentation to the world. Think of him as the manor's prime minister, except with more keys and fewer political scandals. Beside him, ruling with equal power but a completely different style, was the housekeeper. If the butler was the prime minister, she was the general. Her mastery over linens, inventories, schedules, and every female servant would impress even the strictest military commander. She operated with a ledger in one hand and judgment in the other. Towels out of order? Disaster. A chambermaid late by 10 seconds? Catastrophe. A wrinkle in the bedsheet? International crisis. She ran the household with precision and expected nothing less from everyone beneath her, which was everyone. Staff often swore she could detect dust telepathically. Below these titans came the senior staff, each commanding their own miniature kingdoms. The cook ruled the kitchen with an iron ladle. The kitchen wasn't just hot, it was volcanic. You learned quickly that the cook decided who chopped, who stirred, who got shouted at, and who lived to serve another day. The authority came from skill. Feeding an entire manor was a daily miracle, and the cook knew it. Meanwhile, the head gardener governed the grounds with equal fervour, making sure every hedge, herb, and unfortunate apprentice gardener obeyed the natural and unnatural laws of landscape perfection. Then came the footmen, living embodiments of symmetry and polish. Their ranking depended on height, beauty, posture, and the ability to stand for hours without collapsing, frowning, or showing signs of human emotion. First footman was the golden child, allowed to handle delicate tasks and walk slightly closer to the butler at mealtimes. Second footman could aspire upward, if he survived long enough. Third footman existed. Footmen were the decorative furniture of the manor, except furniture didn't have to memorise the exact angle at which to hold a platter. On the gentler side of the service world, though only slightly, the maids were split into their own strict rankings. The ladies' maid stood at the top, personal assistant, hairdresser, confidant, and fashion emergency responder to the mistress. Below her, the parlour maid handled the polished rooms, the chambermaids tackled bedrooms, and the nursery maid lived in constant chaos under the rule of children too young for mercy. Each maid's position wasn't just a job, it dictated the tone of her day, the level of scrutiny she endured, and whether she was allowed to speak indoors without risking doom. At the base of this carefully stacked social tower was the scullery maid, whose title might as well have been person who does everything no one else wants to. She cleaned what others dirtied, carried what others dropped, and got blamed for whatever went wrong, even if she wasn't remotely nearby. She was often the youngest, the newest, and the most exhausted. If the manor hierarchy was a ladder, she wasn't on the bottom rung, she was beneath it, holding the ladder steady while everyone else climbed over her. Outside, another hierarchy lived and breathed in mud and manure. The coachmen outranked the grooms outranked stable boys, and the stable boys outranked no one, not even the horses, who tended to enjoy better accommodations. The coachman controlled the movements of the household's carriage and horses, making him essential, respected, and occasionally feared, especially when he announced that an important ride required servants to work through the night preparing travel supplies. Each servant learned their place fast, not because they enjoyed it, but because the manor functioned like a machine. Every cog needed to stay in its exact place or risk the whole structure collapsing under awkward silence and disappointment. Rank controlled where you stood, who you addressed, what tasks you performed, and whether you dared breathe near the butler's decanter. This ladder wasn't built for climbing, it was built for stability. Most servants would spend years, if not lifetimes, on the same rung. But even if the hierarchy held you in place, it also gave clear expectations. You always knew where you stood, even if where you stood was inconvenient, exhausting, or next to a stack of dishes taller than you. If you thought getting hired for manor service meant simply showing up and announcing, "Hello, I can carry things," you'd be tragically mistaken. Entering service required navigating a social obstacle course where your reputation, posture, shoes, and possibly even your breathing were silently evaluated. One stain on your collar, and suddenly you're morally questionable. It all began with the recommendation, a letter supposedly written to describe your virtues, work ethic, and general ability to not cause disasters. In reality, it was often written by a neighbour who barely remembered your name but owed your family a favour. These letters were so exaggerated they could put modern resumes to shame. Young Thomas possesses an exceptional sense of responsibility usually meant he hasn't burnt anything in at least 3 weeks. Still, without a reference, you were nothing, not no one, nothing. Even the most brilliant potential servant needed someone vouching that they wouldn't run off with the silver or spontaneously combust under pressure. If the letter passed inspection, you might be summoned to the manor for an interview, a terrifying ritual where the employer, or more often the housekeeper or steward, evaluated not just your answers, but your walk, voice, hands, posture, and the number of wrinkles in your clothing. Walking too fast suggested nervousness. Walking too slow suggested laziness. Walking normally suggested, well, that depended entirely on their mood. Your aim was to appear humble, capable, silent, and somehow still pleasant, like a furniture piece with self-awareness. Cleanliness mattered enormously, not the deep cleanliness of modern hygiene, but the visible kind. Smelling slightly of soap? Excellent. Smelling slightly of manure? You must have arrived straight from the farm, understandable but still suspicious. Hair neatly tied, boots reasonably polished, nails trimmed. Perfect. A little dust on your hem? Catastrophic. They weren't hiring your skills, they were hiring your potential to not embarrass the household. One glance from a housekeeper could summarize your entire worth as a human being. Next came the character questions, which were always phrased in a way that made you wonder if you were applying for a job or confessing your sins. Have you ever taken what is not yours? Are you prone to idleness? Do you rise early? Are you of a steady disposition? Your answers didn't matter as much as your delivery. Hesitation suggested deceit. Saying too much suggested instability. Saying too little suggested stupidity. All roads led to failure unless you found the precise middle ground between confident and invisible. Many employers wanted to know your family background, not out of concern for your mother, but because they wanted assurance your relatives wouldn't show up and beg for work, food, or, heaven forbid, wages you hadn't yet earned. Respectable family usually meant no history of theft, scandal, or drunken brawls loud enough to be discussed in church. If you somehow passed the interrogation without bursting into tears or sweating through your entire outfit, you might be subjected to a practical examination. Prospective maids were handed linens and asked to fold them with military precision. Prospective footmen were tested on their posture, their ability to open doors silently, and their capacity to stand like a decorative statue for disturbing lengths of time. Kitchen applicants might be required to peel apples, chop vegetables, or survive 5 minutes under the cook's stare without fleeing. But here was the real test, your trial period. This was essentially a probationary sentence where the manor observed whether you could perform tasks, handle stress, remember instructions, and refrain from screaming into a pillow on your first night. Trial periods ranged from 1 week to several months, depending on how distrustful the employer was or how unlucky you were. During this time, every move you made was quietly recorded in someone's mental notebook. Did you return the broom to the correct hook? Did you curtsy at the appropriate angle? Did you attempt small talk with the butler? Grave mistake. Trial servants often lived in a strange limbo. They worked as hard as the regular staff but had none of the security. One broken plate could earn you dismissal. One overheard whisper could ruin everything. Even dropping a candlestick was enough to condemn you to unemployment, a fate only slightly better than being eaten by wolves. Yet despite the pressure, many people succeeded because servants already in the household could be surprisingly supportive. They remembered their own terrifying first days and occasionally offered quiet advice. Don't stand there. That is her chair. Don't breathe when she's counting the linens. Without their guidance, new hires would collapse long before reaching official acceptance. If your trial period went well, meaning no fires, no tears, and no moments of visible panic, you were officially taken on. You received your rank, your tiny room, and your uniform, or instructions to sew your own. From that point forward, you belonged to the manor's vast social machinery. You had been judged, measured, and deemed adequate. A thrilling endorsement. But beneath all the rules and rituals, the hiring process wasn't merely about skill. It was about trust. Employers wanted servants who would not steal, gossip excessively, argue, faint, complain, or otherwise behave like normal human beings. They sought reliability above all, and reliability was measured through posture, politeness, and unblemished collars. Nothing prepares you for the moment you first step through the manor doors and realise that the building you will live and work inside is roughly the size of your entire village, and, depending on the village, probably sturdier. Your new world is a maze of corridors, staircases, side rooms, front rooms, back rooms, rooms with no purpose, and rooms so fancy you aren't allowed to inhale near them. If you get lost on day one, don't worry. So did the last footman. We still haven't found him. Your first day doesn't begin gently. It begins with someone, usually a housemaid or under butler, whisking you away the moment you arrive, as if they're afraid you'll touch something, or worse, stand still long enough for the wrong pair of eyes to notice you. They march you down polished hallways at a pace that feels carefully designed to prevent you from memorizing anything. Was that a sitting room? A morning room? A withdrawing room? Why are there so many rooms dedicated to the concept of sitting? And more importantly, how many of them are you forbidden from entering? Then comes orientation, which is essentially the manor's way of saying, welcome. Here are 40 rules, 50 rooms, and 12 people whose names you'll forget immediately. You're shown the servants' hall, where you'll take meals quickly and quietly. Then the kitchen, which is loud, hot, and smells like ambition mixed with panic. Next is the scullery, which is cold, wet, and smells like despair. After that comes the laundry, the boot room, the still room, and possibly the back staircase, which you will come to know intimately, because the front staircase is reserved for people who don't scrub things for a living. The tour doesn't end there. You're then shown the areas of the house you must avoid unless specifically assigned. The drawing room, the library, the main hall, the mistress's sitting room, and any place with carpets you aren't worthy to walk on. Some manors had entire wings. Servants weren't allowed to breathe in unless dusting, sweeping, polishing, lighting fires, opening curtains, airing, bedding, setting tables, or performing one of the 1,000 tasks that somehow didn't count as being present. This whirlwind is followed by introductions to the staff. Not friendly introductions, functional ones. This is Mary, she dusts. This is Tom, he polishes. This is Sarah, she runs faster than fear. This is the cook. Do not make eye contact unless you want to be volunteered for something life-threatening. Everyone sizes you up the same way, assessing whether you will lighten their workload or accidentally set it on fire. You, meanwhile, struggle to remember who outranks whom, because a misjudged bow or misplaced greeting can ruin your entire week. Next comes the daunting task of learning expectations, which are delivered with the cheerful bluntness of someone who has long since abandoned gentleness. You are told your hours, long, your duties, many, your mistakes inevitable, your ability to complain non-existent. There is no gentle easing into the work. You are expected to function with the efficiency of a veteran soldier, despite having arrived mere minutes ago. If you drop something, someone will sigh. If you ask the wrong question, someone will frown. If you stand in the wrong spot, someone will appear behind you without making a sound and move you aside like an inconvenient potted plant. And then, as if the manor itself wants to test your spirit, you receive your room, a cramped little space with a bed, a hook for your belongings, and a sense of crushing realism. It is not a personal sanctuary, it is a place to collapse. You'll barely see it during daylight hours, and by the time you do return, you'll hardly care if it's comfortable. Your exhaustion will tuck you in faster than any blanket. The moment you think you've grasped something, anything about your new surroundings, someone will send you on a simple errand. Fetch this from the morning room, they say. The problem is that you have no idea which room is the morning room. You wander down identical hallways until panic becomes your main navigational tool. You listen for clues. You try not to open the wrong door. Every closed room feels like a trap. Eventually, you pass by the same portrait 3 times and realize that the house is slowly, politely defeating you. But here's the surprising truth. Everyone failed on their first day. Even the butler once tripped over a rug as a teenager. The housekeeper once addressed the wrong person as madam. The cook once burned a stew so badly it achieved spiritual significance. The manor expects confusion at first, it thrives on it. Because once you've been dropped into this labyrinth and forced to figure it out, you begin absorbing the place by instinct. You learn the precise creak of the 3rd staircase step. You memorize the quickest route between the scullery and the dining room. You learn which doors stick, which doors bite back, and which doors lead to storage closets filled with items no one has touched since the reign of someone important. By the end of your first day, you haven't mastered anything, but you've survived everything. Your feet hurt, your brain hurts, and you're pretty sure you've aged significantly in the last 12 hours. But you've officially begun to belong to the chaos, to the rhythm, and to the strange, sprawling world that will shape your daily life. If you ever wondered what it feels like to start your day before even the birds have decided whether life is worth chirping about, welcome to the servant's schedule. At a manor, morning doesn't begin when the sun rises. It begins when the servants do, which is roughly 3 hours before the sun even remembers it has responsibilities. Sleep? Sleep is what you dream about while working. The first sound of the day is not an alarm clock, but the housemaid's miserable groan as she forces herself upright in a narrow bed that has seen more exhaustion than comfort. Servants are expected to wake in pitch black silence, tiptoe through corridors, and begin their duties without waking anyone, not even each other. This is especially challenging because the moment you stand, every joint in your body loudly protests the concept of movement. Still, you shuffle into your uniform, pin your hair back, and hope you've put your shoes on the correct feet. Your day starts with a task that defines servant life: lighting the fires. Every bedroom, sitting room, corridor, and occasionally hallway statue seems to require its own carefully tended flame. Fire isn't just warmth, it's the entire household's functioning mood. A cold room means an irritated master, and an irritated master means trouble for everyone within sighing distance. Servants collect kindling, carry coal scuttles that feel heavier than all your regrets combined, and crouch beside cold grates trying to coax embers to life. Fire lighting is an art. Too little fuel and the flame dies immediately. Too much and the room fills with smoke, and you spend the next half hour praying the mistress doesn't walk in while you wave a towel at the problem. And all this happens before dawn, when every shadow looks like a ghost and every sound echoes like a threat. You move through deserted hallways, feeling like a character in a gothic novel, except you're not the heroine discovering secrets. You're the underpaid supporting character making sure the house doesn't freeze. Once the fireplaces are awake, it's time to prepare the household for the waking of its noble inhabitants, who are blissfully unaware that an entire army of exhausted people has already been working for hours on their behalf. Bedrooms must be warmed, drapes open just enough to suggest morning, without blinding the waking family, chamber pots discreetly collected, and wash basins filled with water at precisely the temperature that communicates luxury rather than lukewarm disappointment. One of the quiet horrors of early morning life is fetching water. Houses with primitive plumbing systems still require buckets to be carried up multiple flights of stairs, a task that transforms even the fittest servant into a trembling puddle of muscle fatigue. You develop calves of steel and wrists of iron, though sadly neither are considered formal qualifications for promotion. Meanwhile, kitchen staff begin their own dawn battle. The cook rises early enough to make sunrise feel lazy. She starts planning the day's meals while the kitchen maids clean last night's dishes, chop vegetables, and attempt not to make any noise that could be interpreted as disrespect. Breakfast preparations begin hours before the family eats. Bread must be warmed, tea must be steeped, eggs must be coaxed into existence with perfect timing. The irony that servants often go hungry until after these elaborate meals are prepared is not lost on anyone. You can smell the food. You can hold the food. You simply cannot eat the food. Elsewhere, the footmen join the fray. Their mornings begin with polishing everything: shoes, silver, door handles, decorative objects no one has touched since the last coronation. A footman's silent promise is that every reflective surface will reveal your insecurities in perfect clarity. They also begin preparing dining rooms and hallways, ensuring breakfast service will appear effortless, even though nothing in a manor has ever been effortless. Perhaps the cruelest part of waking up at ridiculous o'clock is that your day has barely begun. You've already put in several hours of work, and the household has not even started breathing properly. There is an eerie calm in the manor during these early hours, a calm created by the absence of the people you are constantly serving. This quiet is the closest thing to peace a servant will experience all day, which is both comforting and deeply tragic. By the time the family finally emerges from their warm, freshly aired rooms, the servants have been awake long enough to question the nature of time, reality, and why humans require so many tasks just to greet the morning. The household appears serene to the noble inhabitants, who assume everything simply organises itself. Fires warm rooms automatically, water arrives in basins as if by magic, and breakfast appears with no visible effort. The servants quietly maintain the illusion, moving between rooms with trays, tools and expressions that say, "I have been awake since the Bronze Age." Yet somehow, despite exhaustion, despite the cold floors, despite endless stairs and silent sprinting, morning eventually settles into rhythm. Servants begin operating like a coordinated machine fueled by habit, adrenaline, and the faint hope that maybe, just maybe, tonight they'll get to sleep for more than 5 hours. Before you could serve a single meal, polish a single banister, or even blink in the general direction of a silver tray, you had to dress the part. Not because the work demanded fashion, trust me, no one scrubbing chamber pots needs to look elegant, but because manners were built on the belief that order began with clothing. Your uniform wasn't merely fabric. It was identity, obedience, and a daily reminder that the household's reputation depended heavily on whether your apron was crisp enough to slice through the air. You weren't dressing up to impress. You were dressing up to survive judgment. For most servants, the uniform was the first lesson in functional discomfort. Take the maids, for instance. Their dresses were made from sturdy fabrics meant to endure stains, scrubbing, kneeling, hauling, lifting, sweating, and the occasional tragic encounter with soot. These materials were durable but about as breathable as a brick. The aprons, however, had to remain immaculate, as if the universe magically protected them from dirt. Aprons were a maid's badge of honour. A spotless apron said, "I am competent." A wrinkled apron said, "I may be competent, but today is not my day." A stained apron said, "Pray for me." Then there were the caps, small, frilled symbols of humility perched nervously on top of each maid's head. Caps had to be tied perfectly, not too loose, not too tight, and positioned like a white flag of surrender to the social hierarchy. Their true purpose was not to keep hair clean. They failed spectacularly at that, but to communicate that the wearer was a respectful, orderly servant who would never dare breathe too loudly in the drawing room. Footmen, meanwhile, wore uniforms that screamed elegance while whispering suffering. Their tailcoats were fitted so tightly they could barely lift their arms higher than shoulder level. The fabric gleamed. The buttons gleamed. The shoes gleamed. Everything gleamed except the footman's spirit. These uniforms looked aristocratic, which was exactly the point. The family wanted their footmen to be decorative extensions of their wealth, like fancy lamps. Except lamps didn't need to stand still for hours without fainting. And the stockings, a footman's stockings, had to be pristine. A wrinkle could bring shame. A sag could bring disaster. A tear? Unthinkable. Legends tell of footmen who walked with the stiffness of marble statues just to protect the integrity of their stockings. The butler, of course, wore the uniform equivalent of authority. His suit was dark, tailored, and silently intimidating. The fabric wasn't flashy, it didn't need to be. The power came from structure. Everything was sharp, the collar, the cuffs, the crease, the stare. A butler's clothing wasn't about beauty, it was about presence. His attire said, "I know exactly where every object in this house belongs, including you." The housekeeper's wardrobe struck a balance between authority and practicality. Her dress was darker, more formal than the maid's, and her keys hung from her waist like trophies won in a long and victorious campaign. The unmistakable jangle of keys announced her arrival, inspiring both fear and respect. Her clothing allowed her to move quickly, while maintaining an aura of control that no one dared challenge. And then came the seasonal misery. Summer meant sweating through layers of fabric that trapped heat like an oven. Imagine sprinting upstairs carrying linens while wrapped in clothing designed by someone who clearly hated comfort. Winter was the opposite. Uniforms offered little protection against freezing hallways. Servants often wore extra undergarments, but these added bulk that made movement awkward and warmth only slightly less theoretical. Outdoor workers suffered the most. Grooms, gardeners, stable boys, all fighting nature while wrapped in garments more symbolic than effective. Each uniform carried symbolism that extended far beyond colour or cut. Darker fabric signalled authority. Crispness signalled discipline. Cleanliness signalled moral character, because society had collectively decided that wiping soot from your face made you a trustworthy person. Even the smallest details mattered. How you tied your apron, how you positioned your buttons, how you smoothed your skirt or straightened your coat. All these details communicated your level of training and your place in the hierarchy. Clothing became a language, and every servant was fluent. But of all the uniforms, none inspired as much universal dread as the laundry maid's. Why? Because she faced the Sisyphean task of caring for everyone else's clothing. She washed, boiled, scrubbed, wrung, dried, and ironed an endless mountain of fabric daily. She knew every weakness in every garment, the fragile seam, the stubborn stain, the hem that frayed at the mention of hard work. And if a uniform was damaged under her watch, the consequences echoed through the entire household. Laundry maids lived with the eternal knowledge that somewhere in the house, a footman was judging their ironing skills with silent fury. Wearing a uniform meant surrendering your individuality every morning. You became part of a larger system, visible, identifiable, and always manageable. But uniforms also offered strange comfort. They gave structure, purpose, and the sense that even if your work was exhausting, at least you looked like you belonged. And belonging mattered. In a world defined by service and expectation, clothing wasn't merely fabric, it was survival. If the manor were a ship, the butler was the captain, minus the mutiny, plus more polishing. His presence didn't just influence the household, it defined it. A butler didn't need to shout or threaten to maintain control. His authority existed in the air itself, humming through every corridor, carried in the smooth glide of his footsteps. When he entered a room, conversation straightened their posture. The butler's power came from a very particular blend of discipline, experience, and absolute composure. He had spent years rising through the servant hierarchy, learning everything from etiquette to crisis management, and he carried that knowledge like an invisible badge. If the household ran smoothly, it was because the butler had anticipated 15 possible disasters and prevented each one with quiet efficiency. His responsibilities began long before breakfast and carried on long after the candles were snuffed. At the core of his role was managing the household's public face, the dining room, the wine cellar, the silverware, the presentation of meals, the orchestration of formal events. If the family appeared dignified, organised and wealthy, the butler was the reason. He was the unseen artist behind every seamless dinner service and every immaculate cocktail tray. Perhaps his most sacred domain was the wine cellar, a cool sanctum where bottles rested like sleeping aristocrats. The butler knew every vintage, every bottle's history, and every guest's preferences. A good butler could recall which wine had impressed a visiting duke 3 years ago, which bottle was nearly past its prime, and which corks were prone to betrayal. Wine management wasn't just storage, it was strategy. Present the wrong vintage and a dinner could shift from pleasant to questionable in seconds. Open a bottle too early and it lost its flair. Too late and the butler risked receiving the look from the master, an expression mild to the untrained eye but sharp enough to make even a seasoned butler reconsider his life choices. Beyond wine, the butler oversaw silverware, a task that may sound simple until you realise that aristocratic households owned enough forks to equip a small army. He kept inventories so exact that he could identify a missing spoon in the middle of a banquet and mentally calculate its last known location. Silver was the household's treasure, and the butler was its guardian. Footmen lived in constant terror of scratching it. The butler also governed the timing of meals, a delicate art that required anticipating the household's rhythms, moods and whims. Breakfast, luncheon, tea, dinner, every meal was a performance. The butler choreographed it all, footmen gliding like clockwork, dishes arriving at the precise moment when hunger turned from polite to impatient, candles lit at the perfect height, table settings arranged with geometric precision. He wasn't just serving food, he was producing a theatrical event where the audience expected perfection every night. Yet his influence extended far beyond dining. The butler managed discipline, which he exercised with a mastery that would make any military officer bow in respect. He didn't scold, he corrected. He didn't punish, he guided. And he did it all with a tone so polite that you didn't realise you were being reprimanded until 20 minutes later, when you replayed the conversation and thought, wait a moment. A footman who arrived late for duties might receive a gentle reminder about punctuality that somehow felt more devastating than being shouted at. A maid who mishandled a vase might endure a pause so heavy it could bend the laws of gravity. Despite his intimidating presence, the butler maintained a strict code of professional neutrality. He did not gossip, though he knew everything. He did not react, though he witnessed everything. He was the household's emotional anchor, never flustered, never rushed, never uncertain. Even the most chaotic situation, a broken plate, a surprise guest, a spilled sauce, a fainting footman barely rustled the calm surface of his demeanour. The family relied on him for stability, and the servants relied on him for structure. Behind the scenes, the butler handled money and logistics, ensuring the household ran with the predictability of a finely tuned clock. Deliveries, bills, supplies, all filtered through his hands. If the family needed a carriage for a sudden departure, he arranged it. If a visitor arrived unannounced, he adapted instantly. If the master requested something obscure, the butler made it appear as though it had been waiting in the pantry all along. But perhaps the most impressive part of the butler's role was his ability to maintain balance in a household full of volatile personalities. He served the family while advocating for the servants. He upheld dignity without sacrificing humility. He enforced order without extinguishing morale. A butler was a mediator, strategist, director, and diplomat, all while wearing a suit that required perfect posture at all times. To the outside world, he appeared almost invisible, blending into the fabric of the household. But to the servants, he was the axis on which the entire ecosystem spun. The cook may have ruled the kitchen, the housekeeper may have commanded the maids, but the butler held the grand design. If the butler was the quiet, polished force steering the manor from the shadows, the housekeeper was the thunderclap that kept the household firmly in line. Her presence could be felt before she even entered a room, an almost supernatural shift in the air that made maids stand straighter, footmen pick up the pace, and laundry piles behave themselves. Her stare alone could smooth wrinkled sheets. The housekeeper's power came from responsibility, not just over tasks, but over people. Every female servant in the house answered to her. She set the tone of order, cleanliness, and discipline with the precision of a general preparing for battle. She woke early, slept late, and spent every hour in between orchestrating the endless work that kept the manor running. Where others saw rooms, she saw duties. Where others saw linens, she saw inventory. Where others saw mild disorder, she saw a personal insult. Her domain was vast. The butler managed the household's presentation, the housekeeper managed its operation. She supervised chambermaids, parlour maids, laundry maids, nursery maids, scullery maids. Every rung of the female staff fell under her command. And she didn't simply give instructions, she inspected, corrected, scrutinised, and silently judged. A chambermaid who left dust on a windowsill would receive a lesson in dust's moral failings. A laundry maid who folded sheets imperfectly would be reminded of the household standards. A scullery maid who fell behind on dishes would feel a shadow behind her and turn around to find the housekeeper, hands folded, disappointment radiating like an aura. One of her most sacred duties was linen control, a task that sounds simple until you understand that a manor contained enough linens to drown a small town. Bedsheets, napkins, tablecloths, towels, runs, covers, curtains, every piece numbered, washed, ironed, stored, rotated, and accounted for. She kept detailed records showing which linens were in use, which were drying, which were being mended, and which were mysteriously missing. A vanishing napkin could trigger an investigation worthy of detective fiction. Nothing escaped her ledger. Her relationship with laundry maids was especially intense. Laundry was endless, relentless, and prone to chaos. Sheets tore, stains refused to leave, irons scorched, water spilled, and drying days depended entirely on the whims of weather. Yet the housekeeper expected perfection. She could assess the quality of an ironed sheet by running her fingertips across it for half a second. She could detect an unwashed spot on a towel from across the room. And she did not tolerate excuses. A wrinkle was not a wrinkle. It was a character flaw. Schedules were the backbone of her authority. The housekeeper decided who cleaned which rooms, when fires were laid, when water was fetched, when sweeping was done, when mending began, and when the staff could briefly breathe. Her schedule was a masterpiece of efficiency, crafted to ensure that every task happened at the exact moment the household needed it. If breakfast was delayed because a maid overslept, the housekeeper knew. If the mistress wanted her dressing room aired earlier, the housekeeper adjusted. If a visiting guest arrived unexpectedly, she reorganized the entire day without blinking. Her ability to multitask bordered on mythical. She could manage a crisis in the laundry, reorganize afternoon duties, instruct a new maid, and still notice that a vase in the hallway had been moved half an inch from its original position. She remembered everything: names, tasks, habits, mistakes, impressions. She knew who was reliable, who was slow, who needed extra guidance, and who required firm reminders to remain focused. The maids depended on her structure, even when they feared her glare. Discipline, of course, was one of her strongest tools. She enforced household rules with fairness but zero softness. A maid caught gossiping instead of polishing furniture might receive additional duties. A maid who broke something valuable would receive a lecture that could rival scripture. She wasn't cruel. She simply believed that order and dignity were non-negotiable. Her methods weren't warm, but they were effective. Under her direction, rooms gleamed, sheets were crisp, carpets spotless, and schedules adhered to with the same reverence as religious ritual. And yet, beneath her iron exterior, there was a deep understanding of the workload her staff carried. She had once been in their shoes, rising early, working late, learning the grueling rhythm of service. She knew exhaustion, frustration, and the crushing weight of endless duties. Her high expectations came from experience, not malice. She fought to maintain standards because she knew the household's functionality relied on discipline, not chaos. And on rare occasions, very rare, she might even show quiet kindness. A small gesture meant only for the struggling maid who needed it. The housekeeper also served as the bridge between the servants and the mistress. She relayed instructions, absorbed complaints, and filtered information with diplomatic finesse. She represented the household's dignity, maintaining a polite exterior while managing dozens of tasks beneath the surface. She was expected to know everything and forget nothing. Failure was not an option. In many ways, the manor breathed through her. Order moved where she directed it. Cleanliness existed where she enforced it. Stability followed wherever she walked. To the outside world, she was invisible. To the servants, she was essential. If there was one place in the manor that could break even the strongest servant spirit, it was the kitchen, a furnace of heat, noise, steam, and perpetual urgency where survival depended on speed, skill, and the cook's unpredictable temperament. Food didn't nourish you, it tested you. From the moment you stepped inside, you understood why servants whispered about the kitchen as if it were a battlefield. The temperature alone could melt your ambitions. Fires roared in great brick hearths, pots boiled with volcanic enthusiasm, and ovens radiated enough heat to make you question whether this was cooking or punishment. Every surface was warm, every tool was dangerous, and every corner hid a chore waiting to lunge at you. At the centre of this chaos stood the cook, a force of nature wrapped in an apron. She ruled her domain with a ladle in one hand and fear in the other. Her authority did not require explanation. Everyone simply knew. The cook had the impossible task of preparing meals that pleased the household, impressed guests, and met the strict timing orchestrated by the butler. One mistake could ripple through the entire day. A burnt sauce could destabilize a dinner. An under-seasoned soup could trigger noble disappointment. A missing dish could spark household panic. The cook felt these pressures, so the kitchen staff felt them even more. Her commands came sharp and fast. Stir that. Chop faster. Not that knife. Where is the pastry? Who moved my spices? The last question, always delivered with growing suspicion, was capable of silencing an entire room. Under her direction worked an army of kitchen maids, sometimes a kitchen boy and, in larger estates, a pastry cook or scullery assistant. Each had a role, though the roles tended to blur into one another when things became frantic, which was every day. The kitchen maids chopped vegetables, plucked chickens, strained broths, peeled mountains of potatoes, and cleaned spills before anyone had had time to notice. Their hands were perpetually red from heat, water, and work. The workload was relentless because the kitchen prepared every meal, not just grand dinners. Breakfast required bread, eggs, porridge, meats, and tea. Luncheon needed lighter dishes, elegantly arranged. Afternoon tea demanded pastries, cakes, and delicate sandwiches whose construction required precision and a certain amount of emotional resilience. Dinner, of course, was the monster. Multiple courses, sauces, roasts, garnishes, and timing so exact that one misstep could ruin the flow of the evening. And while all that was happening, the kitchen also fed the entire servant staff below stairs. The irony. Servants often ate last and quickly, after preparing feasts they could barely smell without triggering hunger-induced hallucinations. You could spend hours seasoning, roasting, and arranging a dish only to eat something entirely different, far less exciting, and served on a plate that had lived 1,000 lives. The environment itself was a test. The fireplaces roared constantly, filling the room with shimmering waves of heat. Steam rose from boiling pots, fogging your vision and leaving your skin permanently dewy in a way that definitely wasn't fashionable. The smell of onions clung to your hair, grease coated your apron, flour settled into your eyelashes, and the floor? Always wet. Always. No one knew why. You could mop it 10 times, and still it would betray you. Noise was another constant companion. Knives chopped in a rhythmic fury, pans clanged with authority, boiling pots hissed, and the cook's voice sliced through it all. Footmen occasionally swept in to collect dishes or deliver instructions from above, but they rarely lingered. The kitchen's atmosphere repelled delicate spirits. The preparation never stopped. Even as one meal was carried upstairs, the next one had already begun its journey into existence. Vegetables needed soaking, meats needed marinating, pastries needed shaping, broths needed tending. Planning wasn't optional. It was survival. The kitchen's clock wasn't a device on the wall. It was the pounding rhythm of never-ending tasks. One of the greatest pressures came from the fact that mistakes were visible. A dish too salty, too cold, too late, or too plain reflected directly on the cook and, by extension, everyone beneath her. A maid who dropped a plate might face a scolding that echoed through the corridors. A burned roast was a catastrophe. A missing garnish a scandal. Every error, no matter how small, carried consequences. Despite all this, the kitchen had its strange camaraderie. The shared suffering bonded the staff in ways peaceful work never could. You learned to communicate with quick glances, gesture-based panic signals, and the occasional whispered warning, "Hot pan behind you." You learned which knife cut quickest, which pot boiled fastest, and which corner you could hide in for exactly 8 seconds before being summoned again. For all its terror, the kitchen was also a place of accomplishment. You could watch raw ingredients transform into lavish dishes. You learned skills no farm could teach you: carving, seasoning, balancing flavours, and operating at speeds that defied logic. Under the cook's strict supervision, you didn't just survive, you improved, whether you wanted to or not. But at the end of the day, you left the kitchen physically drained, emotionally wilted, and carrying smells that would follow you for hours. Walking out of that inferno felt like stepping into freedom. Brief, temporary freedom, but freedom of elusive all the same. Among all the positions in a manor, none carried the same mix of relentless labour, exhaustion, and daily despair as the scullery maid, the lowest rung on the servant ladder, and the one most coated in grease. She was always the youngest, the newest, and the servant whose job description could be summarised as everything unpleasant that no one else wants to do. The good news? You're employed. The bad news? So is the grease. Her day began earlier than everyone except perhaps the cooks. Before the sun had even begun hinting at rising, the scullery maid was already awake, fumbling toward the kitchen with heavy eyelids and a heavier workload ahead. Her first task: collecting the pots, pans and dishes left from the previous night. For reasons known only to the universe, these items always multiplied overnight. A single dinner could somehow produce enough dirty pans to supply an army, and all of them were waiting for her. Washing dishes in a manor wasn't a gentle, sudsy affair. It was a multi-step endurance trial requiring strength, precision, and a stubborn refusal to cry. Pots were enormous, heavy, and coated in a crust that seemed forged in the depths of culinary chaos. Scrubbing them clean took time, muscle, and the kind of determination found in marathon runners. The water itself was a challenge. Buckets had to be hauled from pumps or wells, heated over fires, spilled, reheated, and carried again. If other servants needed water, she fetched it. If something had to be boiled, she boiled it. If something needed rinsing, guess who was there? Always her. The scullery maid lived in a constant state of wetness. Wet hands, wet sleeves, wet floors, wet hair. Everything was damp. By mid-morning her fingers were permanently wrinkled, as if she'd aged several decades in a matter of hours. The floor around her station was perpetually slick, creating a hazard that turned every step into an accidental dance routine. And yet, if she slipped and crashed into a stack of dishes, she still had to clean them. Twice. Once the giant pots were tackled, she moved on to knives, ladles, craters, plates, bowls, trays, cups, kettles, and miscellaneous kitchen instruments whose only common trait was their ability to become unbelievably filthy. And while the kitchen maids handled ingredients, the scullery maid cleaned everything they touched. Spill flour? She swept it. Drip gravy? She wiped it. Drop a spoon? She retrieved, washed, dried, and returned it before the cook detected its absence and unleashed fury. But dishes were only the beginning. Floors needed scrubbing on hands and knees until they gleamed, though gleaming was optimistic given how quickly they became dirty again. Ash had to be carried out from the hearth in soot-covered buckets. Coal scuttles had to be filled and distributed to different parts of the kitchen. The scullery maid also cleaned boots, knives, and sometimes even chamber pots sent down from above stairs. If something required soaking, scouring, scrubbing, scraping, hauling, or complaining about, the task instinctively found its way to her. And then there was peeling, an endless punishment disguised as meal preparation. Potatoes, carrots, turnips, onions, mountains of them. Peeling wasn't a quick chore. It was a meditative journey through monotony, tears, and wrist pain. Onions were the worst. Not only did they consume hours, but they also ensured that the scullery maid would cry for reasons entirely unrelated to emotional resilience. Her position in the hierarchy made things even more challenging. As the lowest-ranking servant, she spoke little and was spoken to often, usually with instructions, corrections, or reminders of tasks she was already performing. She could not question orders, suggest improvements, or ask for rest. If she slowed down, the entire kitchen slowed down behind her. If she fell behind, someone noticed. And someone usually meant the cook, who did not appreciate delays. Meals below stairs offered little respite. By the time she reached the table, the best food was already taken and eaten by servants whose jobs allowed for slightly more dignity. She ate quickly, 2 bites if she was lucky, before being summoned back to the sink to tackle the explosion of dishes freshly returned from the family's meal upstairs. This cycle repeated itself with each meal. Clean, refill, scrub, rinse, repeat until her arms forgot what rest felt like. Despite all this, the scullery maid learned resilience at a pace unmatched by any other servant. She developed strength from lifting heavy pots, speed from working under pressure, agility from dodging footmen rushing through the kitchen, and patience from dealing with tasks that regenerated like mythical beasts. Over time, she understood the rhythms of the kitchen, the moods of the cook, and the choreography of meal preparation. Her greatest reward wasn't praise. She received little of that, but survival. If she endured long enough, she could rise to kitchen maid, then perhaps cook's assistant, and eventually leave behind the mountain of dishes that haunted her dreams. By the end of each day, her body ached. Her clothes smelled like every ingredient ever discovered, and her hands were so pruned they resembled botanical curiosities. But in the quiet moments, when the kitchen finally dimmed and the fire settled, she knew she had accomplished something monumental. She kept the wheels of the household turning one dish at a time. If servants formed the internal machinery of a manor, footmen were the polished ornaments placed on top, visible, elegant, admired, and expected to behave with the composure of someone who had never known panic. They were chosen not for strength or skill, but for posture, symmetry, height, and the ability to look decorative while performing physically demanding tasks. Your job wasn't to think, it was to gleam. The ideal footman was tall, well-proportioned, clean-featured, and capable of standing still for unnervingly long periods of time. He was essentially the human equivalent of a particularly expensive vase, valued for appearance, judged on presentation, and occasionally placed somewhere solely to impress guests. Households proudly introduced their footmen as though they were part of the estate's architecture, and in some ways they were. Uniform beauty standards governed every aspect of a footman's presentation. His hair needed to be neatly trimmed, his face smooth-shaven, his boots polished to a shine so bright it could reflect poor decisions. His coat, fitted within an inch of his ribs, had to hug his torso like it was afraid of being judged. Stockings were white, spotless, and stretched so tightly that even a whisper of sagging could be interpreted as a personal failure. Buttons were polished to perfection. Cuffs were crisp. He wasn't merely dressed, he was curated. But beneath this polished exterior lived an exhausting schedule. Footmen performed an astonishing range of duties, many of them physically demanding. One of their earliest daily tasks was lighting the household's candles, a job requiring precision, grace, and a balancing act between swiftness and silence. Moving through the manor at twilight with a taper in hand, the footman illuminated hallways, drawing rooms, and staircases until the entire estate glowed like a painting. It was delicate work, too slow and the household complained, too fast and wax ended up everywhere, which resulted in stern lectures from those forced to clean it. Footmen also handled bell responses. Every time a bell rang from any room at any moment, a footman rushed to discover what was required. The bell system formed a complex network of tiny mocking reminders that the servants were always needed. Footmen had to know which bell corresponded to which room, sprint to the location without appearing winded, and arrive with a polite bow that said, "Of course I was already nearby," anticipating your desires telepathically. Their most public responsibility was serving meals, a ritual that transformed the dining room into a stage and the footmen into silent performers. They moved in synchronized sequences, presenting dishes, clearing plates, refilling glasses, unfolding napkins, and hovering in just the right position to be useful without becoming noticeable. Timing was everything. If a dish arrived too soon, it disrupted the flow. If it arrived too late, the mistress's eyebrow would rise, a tiny motion with catastrophic emotional force. Serving wasn't just physical, it was mental choreography. A footman had to know the order of courses, the preferences of each guest, the host signals, and the fragile egos of both diners and kitchen staff. And he had to do it all while looking serene and graceful and tragically underpaid. Then came carrying trays, a task that combined strength with elegance. Some trays weighed as much as small livestock. Despite this, a footman was expected to lift them as effortlessly as a bouquet of flowers. Any strain, wobble, or tremor risked humiliation. The goal was to appear supernatural, untouched by gravity, immune to fatigue, and blissfully unaware that your arms were slowly detaching from your body. Footmen also tended to bedrooms, hallways, entrances, and staircases, ensuring all areas were tidy and welcoming. They polished banisters until visitors could see their own self-doubt reflected in the shine. They carried messages between rooms, escorted guests, operated carriage doors, and acted as living displays of the estate's refinement. Despite the elegance of the job, there was no shortage of physical strain. Footmen developed remarkable core strength from maintaining perfect posture, exceptional leg endurance from standing during endless dinners, and world-class self-control from maintaining composure while the family discussed topics so dull they could tranquilize a horse. Socially, footmen occupied a strange middle ground below stairs. They ranked above maids and scullery workers, but below the butler and senior staff. Their work placed them in constant contact with the family, yet they remained completely invisible in social terms. A good footman noticed everything and revealed nothing. He was present without being acknowledged, necessary without being credited, and graceful without being thanked. Yet the position came with aspirations. A diligent footman could rise to under-butler, then perhaps butler, earning respect, better pay, and the right to carry keys instead of heavy trays. Every polished button was a small step toward upward mobility. Still, the heart of the role remained the same, elegance under pressure. A footman who fainted from heat, fatigue, or sheer boredom had to do so quietly. A footman who tripped had to execute the most dignified recovery in human history. A footman who accidentally bumped a guest had to disappear from the narrative entirely. In the end, footmen were the manor's shining surface, literally and metaphorically. Their perfection reflected the household's wealth status and self-image. They weren't just servants, they were symbols. If the manor was a living organism, The maids were its circulation system, always moving, always cleaning, always adjusting, ensuring every room looked effortless even though their own effort was monumental. They were everywhere and nowhere at once, quietly transforming chaos into order. You cleaned rooms you were never allowed to sit in. Each type of maid had her own rhythm, responsibilities, tools and territories, and each territory came with its own brand of misery, challenge and deeply specific dust. The chambermaids were the early morning ghosts of the household. Before the family even contemplated rising, chambermaids were already tiptoeing through bedrooms to open curtains, shake out rugs, empty chamber pots and make guest beds with the speed of a magician and the silence of a criminal. Their hands learned the exact tension required to pull sheets perfectly tight into the graceful art of fluffing pillows without waking their occupants. They dealt with soot from fireplaces, stray hairpins, forgotten handkerchiefs, and the occasional personal item that they pretended not to notice. Chambermaids also refreshed washstands, rearranged furniture after late-night disarray, and ensured every surface gleamed with the type of cleanliness that aristocrats believed happened naturally. Then came the parlour maids, the guardians of the manor's public face. Parlours were sacred spaces, rooms filled with delicate ornaments, polished tables, fragile trinkets, and carpets that required the emotional stamina of a saint to maintain. Parlourmaids dusted everything, even objects with shapes that seemed explicitly designed to trap dust forever. They polished mirrors, tended to decorative plants, set out tea trays, rearranged cushions, and ensured that no guest ever saw a trace of imperfection. If a visitor's hat shed a single feather, the parlourmaid was there within seconds, quietly sweeping it up as though it had committed a crime. Parlourmaids also prepared rooms for afternoon gatherings. One wrinkle in a table runner could ruin the illusion of refinement, so they hovered over their displays like nervous artists. They weren't just cleaners, they were curators of the atmosphere. Yet despite their constant presence in beautifully furnished rooms, they were forbidden from resting in them, even for a breath. A parlourmaid could spend an hour polishing a chair she was never, under any circumstances, permitted to sit on. Meanwhile, upstairs or tucked away in a dedicated corner of the household, a completely different world existed. The nursery. The nursery maid lived in perpetual motion and perpetual noise. Her duties revolved around the children, feeding them, dressing them, watching them, cleaning up after them, and occasionally rescuing them from their own questionable decisions. If the children were infants, the nursery maid managed bottles, swaddles, nappies, blankets, and sleep schedules that made no sense in any known universe. If the children were older, she mediated arguments, organised toys, supervised lessons, and wiped fingerprints off every reachable surface, then off every surface suddenly reachable because a child dragged a chair somewhere it didn't belong. The nursery maid worked under the watchful eye of the nanny, who held authority over the children's entire universe. The maid executed every task swiftly and without complaint, even when the nursery erupted into chaos. Paint spills, crumbs and sticky fingers, tantrums, mysterious stains, inexplicable smells. The nursery maid faced them all with the endurance of a seasoned soldier. Her world wasn't defined by elegance or polish, but by survival, strategic thinking and stain removal. Finally, far from the delicate world of parlours and nurseries, another type of maid fought a different kind of battle, the laundry maid. If linen was the housekeeper's obsession, laundry was the laundry maid's battlefield. Each day she faced mountains of sheets, towels, napkins, shirts, undergarments, and uniforms that had to be washed, rinsed, boiled, wrung, dried, starched, folded, and ironed with military precision. Laundry wasn't just labour, it was endurance training. The water she worked with had to be hauled, heated, sometimes carried again. Washboards rubbed her hands raw. Boiling tubs filled the room with steam, so thick she sometimes disappeared into it like an apparition. Ironing was its own ordeal. The irons were heavy, heated on stoves, and capable of burning through fabric and hope, if not handled perfectly. Laundry maids developed arms of steel, backs of iron, and emotional fortitude unmatched in the household. They knew every sheet intimately, its texture, its stitching, its flaws, and its ability to misbehave at the worst possible moment. What united all these maids was the unspoken demand that they move quietly, work quickly, and take up as little space as physically possible. They were expected to glide through hallways without disturbing a single dust mote, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, and to maintain the illusion that the manor cleaned itself. They navigated stairs with speed, corners with caution, and tasks with unwavering focus. Yet despite the relentless workload, many maids found camaraderie among each other, shared smiles during chaotic mornings, whispered jokes during laundry hours, mutual understanding in the nursery's quiet moments. They formed friendships that softened the edges of long days and softened the blow of endless cleaning. They were the invisible artists behind every shining surface and every immaculate room. They kept the manor beautiful, even when beauty was the last thing their sore hands felt. Life inside the manor was hard, but life outside it was a full-contact sport. The outdoor staff braved mud, manure, wind, rain, sleet, and the occasional animal with questionable intentions. Their world was ruled not by clocks and schedules, but by weather patterns and the moods of horses. If it rained, you got wet. If it didn't rain, it was about to. The groom lived in constant companionship with the estate's horses. His days began before dawn, long before the first carriage rolled out or the master decided he fancied a ride. The groom fed the horses, brushed them, checked their hooves, mucked out stalls, mended tack, and soothed any creature prone to panic, which was most of them. Horses were impressive animals, but they were also drama queens, working at shadows, refusing to cooperate or flattening anyone who walked behind them at the wrong moment. A good groom understood each horse's personality intimately. Some were gentle, others stubborn, others vain, and one was always plotting something. Grooms learned to anticipate which horse would attempt to nip their sleeve, which would use them as a leaning post, and which needed twice the brushing simply to feel emotionally validated. Grooming wasn't just brushing hair. It was maintaining the manor's pride and transportation system. A horse with a matted coat reflected poorly on the estate, and a groom who couldn't handle a spirited stallion risked being launched into the future. Meanwhile, the gardener oversaw an entirely different kingdom, one filled with soil, shears, and a never-ending war against weeds determined to overthrow civilization. Gardens weren't just decoration, they were status symbols. If the grounds looked elegant, the family appeared refined. If the grounds looked wild, the family appeared disorganized. So the gardener trimmed hedges, pruned roses, mowed lawns, planted flowers in precise patterns, and fought pests with the determination of a man who had declared personal war on slugs. Gardening was beautiful in theory and brutal in practice. Summer heat turned the gardener into a walking sunburn. Winter froze his fingers around his tools. Spring made everything grow too fast. Autumn covered all his hard work in leaves that took an eternity to rake, and no matter the season, he could be summoned at any hour to collect flowers, rearrange plantings, or trim a hedge that dared grow uneven. Gardening demanded patience, resilience, and an acceptance that nature did not care about your schedule. Near the stable yard lived another indispensable figure, the coachman. He was master of the carriages, caretaker of the harnesses, and the estate's unofficial expert on roads, wheels, horses, and the moods of aristocrats. If the family needed a carriage at a moment's notice, the coachman made it happen, even if the weather was catastrophic and the horses wished they were somewhere else. His responsibilities went far beyond driving. He maintained the carriages, polished their fittings, repaired wheels, checked the condition of the harnesses, and ensured everything was ready for travel at all times. Weather didn't cancel trips, it only made the coachman's job more hazardous. Mud turned roads into traps, ice transformed them into death wishes, and wind turned every journey into a battle against invisible forces. Yet the coachman kept the reins steady, the horses calm, and the master's journey smooth, at least from the perspective of the passenger fortunate enough to be inside. Alongside these roles existed the grounds crew, a small but essential group responsible for everything the gardener couldn't tackle alone. They cleared paths, chopped wood, hauled stones, repaired fences, dug drainage channels, maintained ponds, and occasionally rescued footmen hopelessly lost during nighttime errands. Their tools were heavy, their muscles were heavier, and their daily battle against the elements was legendary. If a storm hit, the grounds crew worked twice as hard. If a tree fell, they cleared it. If the master decided the estate needed a new path, terrace, or decorative feature, the grounds crew built it, no matter how impractical it was. Weather shaped every hour of the outdoor staff's lives. Rain soaked them, mud swallowed their boots, wind whipped their faces, and snow buried their progress overnight. Even sunshine had its cruelty. Long hours under a blazing sky made every task exhausting. And yet, they carried on, because outdoor work didn't pause for comfort. The animals still needed tending, the carriages still needed readiness, the grounds still needed order. Despite the hardship, outdoor workers found satisfaction in the visible results of their labour. A groom saw his horse gleam, a gardener saw flowers bloom, a coachman saw the carriage glide smoothly down a freshly raked drive. The grounds crew saw a clean path where chaos once lived. Their efforts shaped the estate's first impression, long before visitors stepped through the manor's front doors. They were also a tight-knit group. Working outside meant sharing jokes, comparing blisters, and complaining about weather forecasts that were always wrong. They developed a camaraderie forged through windburn hoof prints, and the universal understanding that no one inside truly appreciated how much effort went into maintaining the estate's picture-perfect exterior. Their world was demanding, unpredictable, and occasionally hazardous, but it was also honest. Outdoor staff didn't deal with social niceties or delicate ornaments. They worked with soil, wood, leather, and muscle, and although they suffered through storms, stubborn animals, and unreasonable requests, they were the estate's backbone, visible proof of its order and strength. A servant's day was not so much a schedule as it was a continuous loop of tasks stitched together with exhaustion. From the moment your eyes opened, if they ever truly closed, to the moment you collapsed back into your narrow bed, every minute had a purpose, every movement a consequence. Breakfast doesn't energize you, just happens to you. The day began in darkness, long before sunrise hinted at the horizon. No bells rang, your body simply knew it was time because it ached in all the familiar places. You rose quietly, careful not to disturb anyone, because the first rule of a servant's morning was silence. Your thoughts had to be silent too, ideally. Then came a rush of early tasks, lighting fires, carrying water, setting out wash basins, opening shutters, shaking out rugs, and preparing rooms for people still dreaming peacefully in their beds. You moved quickly, barely aware of how cold the floor was beneath your feet or how many stairs you'd already climbed. By the time the household began to stir, you'd already completed an hour or 3 of work. But this was only the warm-up. As the day properly began, servants fell into their various roles like pieces of a massive, overly complicated puzzle. Hallways filled with movement, footmen gliding toward the dining room with trays, maids rushing toward bedrooms with fresh linens, kitchen staff appearing from below with baskets and pans. It was a coordinated chaos where everyone knew exactly where to be, except when they didn't, and then everything became a sprint. Breakfast preparations happened below stairs, but upstairs it appeared like magic, neatly plated, steaming and on time. Meanwhile, servants ate their own breakfast in shifts, swallowing food at speeds unsafe for digestion. Rest didn't exist. The moment you sat down, someone needed something. A bell rang. A door creaked. A voice called. Breakfast was less a meal and more a brief pause in the ongoing battle against time. After breakfast, the mid-morning rush began. Bedrooms were tidied, carpets swept, fires stoked again, dressing rooms refreshed and corridors straightened. Servants passed each other constantly, exchanging quick nods or whispered warnings like, "Don't go into the west parlour, the mistress is in a mood." At the same time, preparations for luncheon were already underway. There was no such thing as finishing one task before beginning another. The entire day was layered like a very stressful cake. Messages needed delivering. Guests required attention. Unexpected requests materialized like spontaneous storms. A gentleman wanted his boots cleaned. A lady needed an item fetched from a room located approximately 14 miles away within the labyrinthine manor. Someone misplaced a glove, which instantly became a household emergency. Servants sprinted elegantly or inefficiently depending on role, while maintaining the illusion of calm competence. Midday brought luncheon, a meal deceptively simple for the family, but complicated for everyone else. It meant table settings, dishes carried in sequence, fires monitored, crumbs whisked away discreetly, and drinks poured with precision. Once luncheon ended upstairs, servants entered a frantic cycle of clearing, cleaning, resetting, and collapsing briefly before being summoned again. The early afternoon was a strange mixture of routine and unpredictability. Some servants tended to mending or polishing, others darted off for errands in the village. Maids refreshed rooms that had already been cleaned earlier because someone had dared sit in them. Footmen positioned themselves strategically in hallways in case the family required assistance. And the sound of bells, always bells, chimed through the house like a reminder that servants weren't people so much as living response mechanisms. Tea preparation arrived next, which involved delicate pastries, fine china, and an atmosphere of high stakes. If you thought dinner was stressful, tea could match it in terms of anxiety per square inch. After tea came the whirlwind hour, changing rooms, arranging lamps, guiding visitors, delivering notes, and preparing the dining room for the evening's main performance. Dinner was the crescendo. Even if the day had already wrung you dry, dinner demanded perfection. Multiple courses, footmen lined with geometric accuracy, trays held steadily, dishes timed precisely, and movements choreographed like ritual. While the family enjoyed leisurely conversation, servants worked harder in that single hour than most people worked in an entire day. When dinner finally ended, the clearing began. Dishes returned downstairs in endless waves. Kitchen staff resumed their battle against grime, and footmen reorganized the dining room for morning. Upstairs, maids turned down beds, prepared lamps, closed drapes, and transformed living spaces into peaceful sanctuaries. Night work was quieter but no less tiring. Fires needed banking, doors needed securing. Late-night guests required service. The master might request a drink. A child might wake in the nursery. Candles needed checking. Coals needed adjusting. It felt as though the manor itself refused to sleep until every servant was on the brink of collapse. At last, very late, servants retreated to their rooms, tiny, cramped spaces that felt more like storage niches than personal quarters. You undressed with trembling hands, sank into bed, and sometimes didn't even remember falling asleep. The day dissolved instantly because the next one would begin soon, whether you were ready or not. And that was the rhythm. Constant motion, constant demands, and constant exhaustion, stitched together by the faint, stubborn pride of keeping an enormous household functioning. Below stairs, meals were not moments of leisure. They were pit stops. Necessary, hurried, and governed by rules so firm you could chisel them into stone. Servants didn't dine. They refueled. If you finished chewing before standing up, you were practically on vacation. Unlike the elaborate spreads prepared for the family upstairs, glittering with sauces, delicate pastries, roasts carved with your precision, the servants' table was practical, nutritious enough to keep everyone upright, plain enough to avoid wasting the good ingredients, and plentiful if you arrived at the right second. Meals varied depending on the household's wealth, but even in generous homes, the gap between upstairs and downstairs cuisine was a canyon. The family enjoyed tender meats and refined dishes. Servants received hearty staples like stews, bread, porridge, boiled vegetables, and occasionally leftover cuts from the main table. When dessert appeared below stairs, it was usually the portion that had fallen off the platter on its way back from dinner. Each meal began with seating order, a rigid micro-hierarchy that was etched into the social fabric of the servant hall. No one questioned it, not unless they wanted to risk a silent reprimand from the housekeeper or a raised eyebrow from the butler. Senior staff sat closest to the head of the table, the butler and housekeeper at the top, followed by the cook, lady's maid, and senior footman. Junior staff filled in according to rank, with the scullery maid taking the absolute last seat, if she even sat at all. Most days she hovered near the stove eating in stolen bites while scrubbing pots that seemed offended by the concept of cleanliness. When everyone was seated, though seated was generous, as some servants were halfway off their chairs preparing to jump up at the next bell, the meal officially began, but there was nothing leisurely about it. Servants ate with astonishing speed, mastering the art of consuming food while mentally reviewing tasks waiting for them the moment they stood up. Forks clinked quickly, spoons scraped rapidly, and bread was swallowed with such efficiency it would impress competitive eaters. The cook sat in dignified silence, evaluating whether the food she had prepared for the staff met her personal standards that she rarely shared with anyone. Conversation below stairs was a delicate art. It had to be quiet, quick, and respectful of the presence of higher-ranking staff. Rumours might be whispered, jokes exchanged, or frustrations vented in short bursts, but everything stopped the moment a superior entered. Even laughter had to be practical, restrained, tidy, and limited to seconds. The housekeeper occasionally used meals as opportunities to remind everyone of upcoming tasks, deadlines, or deficiencies that had displeased her earlier. These announcements, delivered between spoonfuls, had the strange effect of making the stew taste slightly more stressful. Though meals were short, they were essential moments of shared humanity. Servants breathed, exchanged tired glances, and reassured each other that they were, in fact, still alive. Some friendships formed here, forged through mutual suffering and the kind of humour that only emerges from exhaustion. A footman might pass extra bread to a new servant. A chambermaid might quietly slip the scullery maid a bit of leftover pudding. These small kindnesses held the household together as much as the strict hierarchy did. Still, no matter how comforting the moment tried to be, the bell system stalked every meal like a hungry wolf. A single ring could yank a servant away mid-bite. Footmen were the most frequent victims, often abandoning a half-eaten plate to sprint upstairs. Sometimes their meal was collected cold on their return, sometimes it disappeared entirely. There was no sympathy for hunger when the mistress wanted her shawl or the master needed a letter delivered. Afternoon meals had their own rhythm. Luncheon below stairs was slightly calmer than breakfast and dinner, but calm was relative. It was a chance for servants to regroup, exchange updates about the day's tasks, and prepare for the next onslaught of work. Tea for the staff was always improvised, whatever was left in the kitchen, once the family and guests were served. Occasionally a servant might sneak a crumb of a delicate cake, but this act required stealth worthy of a master thief. Dinner, served late for the family and even later for the servants, was often the most chaotic meal of all. By the time it arrived, everyone was exhausted, hungry, and covered in the residue of a long day. If the downstairs table had rules, they became softer once the clock edged toward the night. Jokes grew sillier, sighs grew louder, and everyone ate as though replenishing a soul that had been scraped thin by the day's demands. Yet even at the end of the night, no servant fully relaxed. There were dishes to clear, pots to scrub, lamps to check, fires to bank, and preparations for morning already forming in the back of everyone's minds. A servant's day didn't truly end. It faded slowly, like embers cooling after an intense blaze. But for a few precious minutes at each meal, servants found community in the chaos. They shared food, stories, and frustrations. They restored their strength. And they reminded themselves, between swallowed mouthfuls, that tomorrow they would do it all again. In a manor, privacy was a luxury reserved for the wealthy, the titled, and occasionally the family dogs. Servants, on the other hand, lived in an environment where personal space was about as mythical as unicorns. Your room was any corner you fell asleep in. Most servants didn't have private quarters. Instead, they were assigned to shared dormitories, narrow rooms tucked into the manor's least desirable spaces, under eaves, beside chimneys, or above kitchens where the heat rose in summer and vanished in winter. These dormitories were filled with beds squeezed so close together you could identify your roommates by the sound of their breathing. If someone shifted in the night, the entire room felt the tremor. The beds themselves were the triumphs of minimalism. Thin mattresses stuffed with lumpy filling, blankets that had survived generations, and pillows that offered more symbolism than support. Creaking bed frames formed their own nocturnal symphony, a constant reminder that rest was fleeting and silence impossible. Even turning over was a calculated risk. Move too much and you might wake someone, earning yourself a morning glare sharp enough to cut linen. Storage was another myth. Servants rarely owned more than a handful of possessions, but even those few items had nowhere to go. A small trunk or wooden box at the foot of your bed served as your closet, dresser, and personal archive all at once. If you were lucky, you got a hook on the wall. If you were unlucky, you stacked your belongings and prayed gravity was on your side. Privacy didn't just vanish, it was actively discouraged. Light was scarce. Dormitory windows were tiny, drafty, or positioned at angles that offered a scenic view of a brick wall. Candles were rationed, so the room often remained dim, lit only by moonlight slipping through cracks in the shutters. Conversation happened in whispers, complaints were muttered into blankets, dreams were held quietly, because even your thoughts felt too loud for the space. And then there was the constant presence of others. You woke up beside people, dressed beside people, prepared for bed beside people, and sometimes stepped directly onto someone's foot because the floor offered no room for error. You learned to share everything: space, sounds, air, and occasionally the nightmares of someone whose day had been even worse than yours. The rhythm of dormitory life meant you could not have a secret, a sulk, or a moment of solitude without someone being 2 feet away and accidentally witnessing it. Hierarchy followed servants into their quarters. Senior staff sometimes received marginally better rooms, still cramped but with maybe 1 roommate instead of 6. The highest-ranking female servants, like the lady's maid or occasionally the housekeeper, had their own rooms, though own rooms simply meant a slightly larger closet with a bed inside. Male staff fared similarly. The butler had private quarters, but junior footmen often slept in shared rooms so tight they had mastered the art of changing clothes without fully extending their elbows. The scullery maid, naturally, got the worst arrangement. Her bed might be in a corner of the kitchen, an alcove near the scullery, or a dark nook beside a storage room. Some manors didn't bother giving her a proper dormitory at all, treating her sleeping space as a matter of wherever she collapses least inconveniently. With so little privacy, servants developed impressive techniques for mental escape. Some learned to think quietly under blankets, creating entire inner worlds during the few minutes before sleep claimed them. Others whispered stories to each other in the dark, sharing gossip, hopes, or jokes that helped ease the day's exhaustion. Dormitories forged friendships that would not have formed anywhere else. Forced proximity sometimes became comforting, even protective. Of course, shared living came with challenges. Snoring was a universal enemy. Talking in one's sleep was another. Someone always had cold feet. Someone always rolled over too abruptly. Someone always got up in the middle of the night for early duties, waking everyone else with a soft thud or whispered apology. Conflicts happened, but servants learned to settle them quickly. No one had the energy for long grudges when work loomed ahead at dawn. Heat and cold played their own tricks. In summer, the dormitory became a suffocating oven where everyone lay awake praying for a breeze. In winter, servants huddled under threadbare blankets, shivering in unison. Breath fogged in the air. Frost sometimes crept along window panes. Waking up was a triumph of willpower. Despite the discomfort, these quarters were where servants shared the briefest moments of humanity. Here they told each other their childhood stories, discussed impossible dreams, practiced sewing or mending, or shared small tokens from home. Quiet laughter happened here, the kind too soft to reach the ears of authority. In these cramped rooms, servants carved out pockets of personal identity in a rigid world that rarely allowed it. But even in these tiny acts of rebellion, the truth remained. Privacy did not exist. Everything was communal, visible, audible, and sometimes smellable. Personal boundaries blurred. Individuality shrank to make room for duty. Life below stairs required constant cooperation, constant compromise, and the acceptance that your world would never belong solely to you. It was not comfortable, but it was shared. And sometimes, sharing was the closest thing to comfort a servant ever had. A servant's wages were a remarkable thing, small enough to keep you humble, large enough to keep you working, and structured in such a way that you constantly wondered how numbers could feel both something and nothing at the same time. Your wages could buy anything, except all the things you needed. Most servants earned what could generously be described as modest pay. The amount varied by rank, household status, and sheer luck. Senior staff like the butler and housekeeper earned respectable sums, though still dwarfed by the wealth they managed daily. Lower-ranking servants, most of them earned far less. A maid might look at her yearly income and feel proud for half a second before remembering that yearly meant exactly what it sounded like. She had to stretch that sum across 12 months, several emergencies, and at least one pair of shoes that always wore out too soon. Footmen sometimes earned slightly more because of their visibility and the prestige they lent to the household. But even their wages barely cushioned the cost of the uniforms they were expected to maintain. Tailored coats, stockings, polished shoes, linen shirts, they all demanded constant upkeep. Many servants sent a portion of their wages home to support their families, leaving them with even less for themselves. Rising through the ranks helped, but not everyone could climb the household ladder. And even among those who did, financial security remained more dream than reality. Yet servants were not completely stranded. Room and board provided the illusion of comfort. They didn't pay for housing, food or heating, though they absolutely paid emotionally for the quality of the first two. The manor fed them, clothed them in uniforms, and provided a place to sleep, though place varied widely in comfort. From an economic perspective, it seemed generous. From a human perspective, it was manageable. Still, the arrangement allowed employers to justify low wages. After all, if you were fed and housed, surely you didn't need much money. True, you weren't paying rent or grocery bills, but you did need to purchase shoes, soap, thread, and the occasional mending for your uniform. You paid for candles if you wanted light in your room. You paid for postage if you wrote home, and if your one pair of boots disintegrated, which they frequently did, you faced weeks of misery until you saved enough to replace them. Then there was the strange financial ecosystem of tips and gratuities. Visiting guests sometimes left coins for the servants who attended them, footmen, chambermaids, coachmen. These tips could be surprisingly generous or insultingly small, but they made real differences in a servant's yearly earnings. A footman might earn almost as much in tips during a busy social season as he did in wages. A maid could receive a few coins that transformed her entire week. But tips depended entirely on guest generosity, and generosity was not evenly distributed among the aristocracy. Another predictable but essential supplement was holiday gifts, often referred to as Christmas boxes. These were small sums, or occasionally useful items given by the family at year's end. Servants looked forward to them, budgeted around them, and in some cases survived because of them. But boxes were not guaranteed. Some families were generous, others not so much. A servant might dream of receiving a warm shawl or a few extra shillings, and instead open a parcel to find a handkerchief and a firm reminder of humility. There were also perks disguised as privileges. For example, servants were sometimes permitted to keep kitchen scraps or leftover ingredients that couldn't be reused for the family meals. This meant the difference between a mediocre supper and a slightly less mediocre supper below stairs. Staff might also receive cast-off clothing from the family, which could be altered into wearable garments, assuming you had sewing skills and a high tolerance for fashion choices last seen on aristocratic relatives. Other perks were subtle but important. Servants sometimes gained access to the household's discarded reading material, newspapers, pamphlets, old novels. They learned by watching the family's habits, table manners, etiquette, literacy, and occasionally snippets of social politics. A lady's maid or valet could acquire skills that made them valuable beyond the manor's walls. Even a chambermaid might pick up sewing techniques or cleaning expertise that opened future opportunities. But all these advantages, scraps, gifts, tips, knowledge, were unpredictable. What was predictable was the financial tightrope every servant walked. Illness meant lost wages. Mistakes could lead to fines. Uniform damage had to be repaired at personal expense. Saving money required near heroic discipline. And yet many servants managed it. They squirreled away coins in secret pockets, tucked savings into soap boxes, or hid them beneath floorboards. They dreamed of futures outside the manor, marriage, a small shop, a life with marginally fewer bells controlling their movements. For some, the dream became reality. For others, the household consumed their labour for decades, offering stability but little else. The illusion of wealth followed them always, the grand surroundings, the elegant meals they served, the glittering guests they attended. But none of that belonged to them. Their world was polished, but their pockets were not. Still, pride existed. Pride in surviving, pride in managing, pride in saving even a few coins. Servants mastered the art of stretching wages across time, like thread across a looming tear. And through it all, they lived in a world where riches were constantly on display yet permanently out of reach. A daily reminder of the distance between the hands that held power and the hands that polished it. If the manor ran on labour, it survived on rules. Written, unwritten, whispered, implied, and sometimes invented on the spot. Servants lived in a world where expectations were strict, consequences were swift, and the butler's quiet disapproval could freeze your soul. The rulebook had one main rule: don't exist loudly. Every servant learned these rules immediately upon entering service, not because someone handed them a neat little guide, but because they were enforced through tone, routine, and the occasional horror story passed down by senior staff. Manners mattered as much as efficiency. To be a servant was to become background scenery, helpful but invisible, efficient but spaunt, ever-present but never intrusive. The family wanted their comforts without acknowledging the human beings providing them. The most fundamental rule was silence. Servants did not speak unless spoken to. They did not chatter in hallways, did not greet guests unless instructed, did not comment on the household's affairs, and certainly did not raise their voices. Even footsteps were expected to be quiet. Servants perfected an elegant glide that allowed them to move through rooms without drawing attention. Talking while working was allowed only below stairs, and even then, volume was moderated by the proximity of authority. Next came discretion. A servant saw everything: arguments behind closed doors, midnight wanderings, secret romances, mysteriously missing items, sudden changes in mood. But speaking of these things was forbidden. Sharing gossip outside the house was grounds for instant dismissal. Even exchanging too curious looks during dinner service could earn a reprimand. Servants practiced the fine art of selective deafness and strategic blindness. Punctuality formed another pillar of discipline. Being even a minute late for duties was unacceptable. Servants synchronized their internal clocks to the household's rhythm, always ready for the next task. The bells reinforced this system, ringing out commands with relentless frequency. If you were slow to answer, you risked being noticed, and few things were more dangerous than being noticed at the wrong moment. Cleanliness and order applied not just to rooms but to servants themselves. Uniforms had to be immaculate, hair tidy, hands clean, expressions neutral. No servant could appear dishevelled, distracted or distressed. Emotional turmoil was something you addressed in the 3 minutes before falling asleep. Outwardly, you maintained composure. The butler, the ultimate enforcer of these invisible laws, rarely raised his voice. His terrifying silence did all the work. A single pause in his sentence, a deliberate look, or the measured placement of a teacup could communicate an encyclopedia of disappointment. He did not need threats. His presence alone reminded everyone what perfection looked like, and how far from it they currently stood. Rumour had it that a butler's raised eyebrow once sent a footman into a week-long existential crisis. But violations happened, as they must in any tightly wound system, and when they did, punishments followed. These ranged from mild corrections to severe consequences, depending on the offence and the household's temperament. Minor mistakes earned verbal warnings, short, crisp, impossible to forget. Mind the posture. Attend more promptly. That tablecloth is uneven. Aim for quietness, not chaos. A servant might also receive additional duties, often ones designed to teach a particular lesson. Break something. Prepare to polish the entire silver cabinet. Miss a task. Expect to redo 3 others. Appear distracted. Enjoy reorganising every candle in the manor. For more serious offences, talking back, mishandling valuables, disrespecting superiors, the punishment escalated. The housekeeper might assign the offender unpleasant chores or revoke privileges such as shorter breaks or occasional outings. Repeat offenders found themselves monitored, corrected, and sometimes placed under the relentless supervision of someone who believed strongly in character building through suffering. But the gravest danger was instant dismissal, a phrase that loomed over servant life like a thundercloud. Dismissal meant losing your income, your home, your references, and sometimes your reputation. A servant fired under unfavourable circumstances could struggle to find work again. The reasons for dismissal varied widely: theft, drunkenness, insubordination, revealing secrets, inviting outsiders inside, or behaving improperly with members of the household. Sometimes even small errors could trigger it, depending on the master's temper. Dismissal wasn't always loud. Sometimes it came quietly. An unexpected request to pack your belongings, a final conversation with the housekeeper, a door shutting behind you. Other times it erupted dramatically, with shouting from the master or mistress and the entire staff listening in horrified silence. Either way, it was a servant's nightmare. Yet for all the rules and reprimands, servants developed remarkable strategies for avoiding trouble. They learned where to stand, how to hold their hands, when to breathe, and which corners of the house allowed for a brief moment of unobserved existence. They learned to predict the moods of superiors, anticipate instructions, and fix errors before anyone noticed. Servants also supported one another. A senior maid might quietly correct a junior's posture. A footman might whisper a warning before the butler arrived. These acts of solidarity didn't break the rules. They bent them in humane directions. Still, the rules never went away. They shaped every day, every movement, every moment of the servant experience. Living within them required discipline, humility, and the flexibility of someone who knew the slightest misstep could have consequences. But through this rigid world, servants found a strange resilience. They endured, they adapted, they mastered the art of silent survival in a household that demanded perfection without acknowledging the cost. Serving the family upstairs required a delicate balance of artistry, obedience, intuition, and supernatural stealth. It meant being present without ever becoming noticeable, efficient without ever appearing rushed, and attentive without ever revealing a single personal thought. The goal was to be helpful but not human. Every interaction with the family operated under a strict etiquette system that servants absorbed like second nature. You didn't simply enter a room. You glided in after knocking discreetly, waited for permission, and kept your eyes respectfully lowered. You didn't simply speak. You offered short, polished responses, never emotional, never opinionated, never more than strictly necessary. And you certainly didn't initiate conversation. That was a violation so grave it belonged in its own circle of social hell. The family saw servants constantly yet never acknowledged them as individuals. A footman might stand behind a dining chair for an hour without receiving a single glance. A maid could tidy a room while the mistress read a letter and never earned so much as a nod. Servants existed like furniture that moved on command. Polite furniture, skilled furniture, furniture with an uncanny ability to predict need before they were spoken aloud. Dining service was the pinnacle of this invisible choreography. Mealtimes upstairs were performances, elegant, slow-moving, ritualistic events where every dish had a correct entrance, every movement had a direction, and every servant had a precise place in the formation. A footman pouring wine did so at just the right angle, stopping before the liquid trembled. Another carried trays as though hovering, placing dishes silently. his fingers avoiding the china's rim with practiced precision. The butler oversaw it all like a seasoned conductor, using only subtle gestures, an incline of the head, a shift of posture, to direct the flow of service. Conversation at the table formed its own challenge. Servants weren't supposed to hear it, even though they stood close enough to memorize every detail. Children arguing, guests complaining, the mistress offering strong opinions on the cut of someone's coat. Servants absorbed none of it. They simply stared ahead or into the middle distance, cultivating the expression of someone who had willingly traded their ability to interpret sound. At times, the expectation to be unnoticed bordered on absurd. A footman could be standing directly beside the master's chair and still be expected to shrink spiritually if the conversation turned private. A chambermaid dusting a sitting room while the mistress practiced her piano was required to maintain the illusion that she was deaf, blind, and unbothered by the fact that a vase had nearly fallen on her foot. But invisibility did not mean passivity. Far from it. Servants needed anticipation. They needed to know when a guest might want more tea, when a master was about to ring, when a child was moments away from causing chaos, and when a lady's shawl was slipping from the back of her chair. Servants predicted needs by studying habits, the way the family picked up a fork, the sigh that preceded a request, the polite cough that hinted at thirst. They became experts at responding to signals so subtle they might as well have been telepathic. Even outside dining hours, interactions required care. Serving tea in the drawing room meant arranging the cup and saucer just so, offering sugar tongs with a steady hand, and withdrawing with the soft steps of someone hoping their existence might soon be forgotten. Fetching items for the mistress involved interpreting vague instructions like, "Bring me that book I like," which meant scouring every room until you found the correct one, or dying trying. One of the constant challenges was timing. If you arrived too quickly, you startled the family. Too slowly, you inconvenienced them. Too close, they felt crowded. Too far, they wondered where you were. Servants developed an internal compass for positioning, an instinctual understanding of distance and approach. You learned to walk softly, stand lightly, breathe quietly, and vanish instantly. And then there was the fear of being noticed for the wrong reason. A dropped spoon, a wobbling tray, a misheard command, any slip could draw unwelcome attention. Being noticed meant being evaluated. Being evaluated meant risking criticism. And criticism, depending on the household, could ripple through the entire staff, reaching the butler, the housekeeper, and anyone unlucky enough to be near the scene. Servants interacted with the family in deeply asymmetrical ways. They were witnesses to personal joys, arguments, illnesses, celebrations, secrets, and sorrows, yet they themselves remained closed books. A servant could watch a child grow up, hear a couple quarrel, observe the master's anxieties, and never share their own feelings in return. Emotional self-erasure was part of the job. Yet within the rigidum structure, servants developed remarkable emotional intelligence. They understood the family better than the family understood themselves. They could read disappointment in the mistress's tight smile, frustration in the master's posture, or impending disaster in the way a guest set down a teacup. Servants were the household's emotional barometers. Despite everything, the role carried pride. Performing service flawlessly, precise, discreet, almost invisible, was a skill few could master. When guests commented on the household's elegance or seamless hospitality, servants shared a quiet sense of achievement. It was tiring, it was demanding, it was at times emotionally hollowing, but it was work executed with expertise, discipline, and an unwavering understanding of one truth. The family's world ran smoothly only because servants made themselves disappear inside it. If the manor itself had a heartbeat, it pulsed through the servants' quarters, where whispers moved faster than footsteps and secrets spread faster than spilled tea. Servants saw everything, especially what they wished they hadn't. For all their enforced silence and invisibility upstairs, below stairs, servants lived in a parallel world of information. They knew the family's quirks, habits, tempers, schedules, preferences, romantic entanglements, suspicious purchases, poor musical attempts, and dramatic sulks. Not because they were nosy, though some absolutely were, but because it was impossible not to know. When you cleaned someone's room, dressed someone's bed, poured someone's tea, and stood behind someone's chair for 40 minutes at a stretch, you learned things. Many things. Chambermaids, for example, were the first witnesses to subtle domestic chaos. They entered bedrooms after arguments, noticing pillows tossed angrily, letters ripped up in tiny confetti explosions, or shoes flung in a pattern that suggested emotional aimlessness. They saw books left open on suspicious pages. They discovered dried tear stains on handkerchiefs. They found misplaced personal items that told entire stories without a single spoken word. A chambermaid often knew when a marriage was tense long before the family acknowledged it. Footmen became accidental keepers of emotional secrets. Standing stiffly behind chairs during dinners, they heard half-muttered comments, icy exchanges, and whispers meant only for neighbouring guests. They saw who avoided whose gaze, who smiled too broadly, and who drank more wine than usual to cope with someone else's presence. They carried love letters to the post. They carried responses back in trembling envelopes. They truly knew which relationships were hanging by threads and which had already snapped. The lady's maid was perhaps the most informed of all. She dressed the mistress, fixed her hair, soothed her nerves, listened to her vent, and absorbed every sigh of frustration. Ladies confided things to their maids that they didn't even admit to their husbands. Disappointing social outings, wardrobe disasters, awkward flirtations, suspected rivals, nothing escaped the dressing room. The lady's maid became a quiet vault of upper-class anxieties and sometimes ill-advised romantic plots. Downstairs, this constant flow of upstairs knowledge collided with the natural human urge to talk. Gossip, however, was not reckless. It was strategic. Servants didn't shout secrets. They exchanged them in coded snippets during polishing sessions, whispered conversations at the laundry table, murmured comments by the scullery fire, or quick mutterings while rushing to answer a bell. It wasn't malicious, well, not usually. It was bonding. It was survival. It was entertainment in a life that allowed very little of it. The real social network below stairs ran on 3 principles. Information is currency. A maid who revealed the mistress's awful attempt at embroidery had leverage for days. A groom who heard the master arguing with a neighbour became the afternoon's breaking news. A footman who noticed a mysterious gentleman caller. He held the gossip equivalent of gold. Secrets spread according to rank. Senior servants curated gossip with caution. The butler treated information like dangerous chemicals, stored safely, dispensed rarely. The housekeeper filtered stories with the quiet efficiency of someone who knew exactly which details could cause trouble. Junior servants, however, often shared gleefully until they discovered the consequences of misjudging their audience. Knowledge created alliances. A chambermaid who whispered an upcoming scandal to the laundry maid forged a temporary friendship. A stable boy who leaked news about a guest's disastrous riding habits became a hero. A footman who exaggerated a harmless exchange created drama that fueled conversation for a week. But gossip wasn't only about the family. Servants also discussed each other with enthusiasm. Romantic crushes, rivalries, personality quirks, triumphs, mistakes, embarrassing moments. Nothing escaped the grapevine. The cook's bad mood, the nanny's exhaustion, the new maid's suspiciously fancy hairpin. Every detail became potential conversation. And because servants lived and worked in constant proximity, each rumour travelled through the household with breathtaking speed. Someone could sneeze on the 3rd floor and 3 minutes later the scullery maid would know precisely how loud it was. Despite this, gossip served a vital emotional role. It allowed servants to vent frustrations they could never express upstairs. It helped them process the strange, privileged world they observed but did not belong to. It gave them laughter on days that felt unbearably long. Even tragic news, illnesses, money troubles, relationship breakdowns was softened when shared among those who understood the relentless pressures of service. Of course, gossip had its dangers. Spread the wrong secret and you risked angering the housekeeper, or worse, the butler. Pass along a false rumour and you could fuel a misunderstanding with real consequences. Most servants learn discretion quickly. Talk freely, but know when to stop. A careless word could lead to reprimand or dismissal. The safest rule was simple: gossip downwards or sideways, never upwards. Still, the servants' shared knowledge formed a kind of collective intelligence. They understood the household with a level of insight the family could not imagine. They sensed tension before it escalated. They predicted mood shifts before breakfast. They prepared rooms based on subtle cues no one else noticed. Their gossip wasn't merely entertainment, it was the operating system of the household. Servants lived on the edges of other people's lives, observing, interpreting, and sometimes enduring more than their fair share of awkwardness. They saw the aristocracy unedited, imperfect, emotional, petty, dramatic, insecure, extravagant, occasionally kind, and frequently ridiculous. And though they never said it aloud, they all knew the truth. The family believed they were the centre of the manor. The servants knew they were the audience, the archivists, and the whispering historians of everything that truly happened. A servant's day off was the shimmering mirage of the manor world, promised, anticipated, talked about in dreamy tones, and then, when it finally arrived, often more tiring than a workday. A day off meant you got to do chores, but for yourself. Most servants received 1 day off per week, though day was generous. It usually began after the morning rush and ended long before the evening duties. The time in between was a frantic attempt to live a life outside the manor's walls, squeezed into hours that evaporated faster than hope on laundry day. The moment a servant was released, they practically fell out the back door, blinking at the sunlight like creatures emerging from a cave. The first destination was almost always church, not because everyone was pious, though plenty were, but because attendance was socially expected. It was one of the few times servants appeared in public, not as part of someone's staff, but as themselves, albeit selves who were still judged by their employers, neighbours, and occasionally God. Church was a curious mix of relief and performance. Servants reunited with family members, exchanged quiet greetings with other servants from nearby households, and listened to sermons that usually emphasized humility, duty, and other virtues they could recite in their sleep. Some servants actually napped sitting upright, perfecting an expression of serene holiness, while mentally drifting into unconsciousness. The ability to sleep during a sermon without slumping sideways was a highly respected talent. After church came the errands, which were numerous. Servants had 1 chance per week to buy everything they needed: soap, pins, buttons, thread, stockings, candles, stationery, the whole occasional cheap ribbon, and perhaps a little treat if money allowed. Shops were busy, queues long, and prices painfully fixed. Servants did the math in their heads, subtracting and resubtracting to ensure they didn't overspend. 1 wrong purchase could mean no candles for a week, an especially tragic fate for anyone hoping to read a borrowed pamphlet at night. Some servants visited family, walking miles to reach cottages or villages that felt worlds away from the manicured lawns of the estate. These visits were emotional marathons. Families wanted to hear stories, updates and reassurances that their child's sibling or cousin was not being mistreated. They sent servants back with small gifts: fruit, bread, mended handkerchiefs, or letters to deliver. The affection was deep, but the clock was always ticking. Missing the return time was not an option unless one enjoyed disciplinary conversations with the housekeeper. Others chose to spend their free hours in modest socialising. Servants met friends at alehouses, exchanged gossip with people from other estates, played simple games, walked through markets, or strolled along village roads pretending for a fleeting moment that they ached less than they actually did. A lucky servant might even experience something as rare as leisure, sitting by a river, enjoying a quiet bench or eating an apple without someone shouting their name 5 seconds later. And then there was the complicated realm of romance. Days off were the only opportunities to meet a sweetheart, flirt awkwardly, exchange letters, or take a brief walk hand in hand before remembering that both of you had to be back at work before evening. Relationships between servants were common but fragile. Distance, exhaustion, and unpredictable schedules turned courting into a logistical puzzle. Still, many tried. Love, however impractical, found a way. Not all activities were so uplifting. Some servants used their day off to rest, if rest meant collapsing on a relative's sofa or dozing in a chair, waking up only when someone offered them tea. Others used the time to wash their personal clothing, mend worn-out stockings, scrub boots, or maintain uniforms. Ironically, these tasks often required tools found only in the manor, so servants sometimes completed part of their day off back at work, quietly using equipment while pretending this didn't defeat the entire purpose of having a day off. But no matter how a servant spent their precious hours, one truth remained: the day never felt long enough. The sun seemed to sprint across the sky on a servant's free day, rushing toward the inevitable moment when it was time to return. The walk back to the manor carried a familiar weight, reluctance mixed with resignation, fatigue overshadowed by duty. Returning was a strange ritual. Servants passed through the back entrance, crossing the invisible boundary between person with a life and person who must be ready to polish something at any moment. They changed into work clothing, retied their hair, straightened their posture, and resumed the rhythm of service. The manor swallowed them again, as though they had never left. Still, those brief hours of freedom mattered. They reminded servants that there was a world beyond the estate, a world with family, friends, laughter, sunlight, and moments where they could sit without consequence. Days off offered hope, however fleeting. They weren't restful, not really, but they were essential to the spirit. A servant returned to work exhausted, yes, but also steadied, strengthened by the knowledge that somewhere outside the manor, their life pulsed quietly, waiting for the next sliver of time they could call their own. If there was one thing the manor refused to acknowledge, it was the concept of servants getting sick. Illness might have been a fact of human biology, but within the household it was treated more like an inconvenient rumour, something whispered about but never fully accepted. There's no sick leave unless you count fainting but still holding the tray. Servants lived in close quarters, worked long hours, slept too little, and pushed their bodies through cold mornings, damp corridors, and physically punishing tasks. Illness was inevitable. The problem was that rest wasn't. A servant who woke up coughing or dizzy was expected to soldier on unless they were physically incapable of standing, and sometimes even that wasn't considered disqualifying. Minor ailments, like headaches or sore throats, were dealt with quietly. Servants swallowed herbal concoctions, tied cloths around aching joints, or endured the symptoms until they faded. A maid with a fever might simply move slower, hoping no one noticed, because confessing weakness meant risking reprimand, or worse, temporary removal from the roster, which meant falling behind in duties and losing the approval of the housekeeper. Injuries were even more complicated. A cut from chopping vegetables, a burn from a pan, a twisted ankle from rushing downstairs, or a bruised shoulder from lifting something heavy. These were considered part of the job, as routine as polishing silver. The scullery maid carried so many small burns she could have passed for a piece of living parchment. Footmen developed stiff backs from lifting trays and standing for hours. Gardeners often walked around with hands that resembled artifacts from archaeological digs. Yet no one spoke of these pains unless the injury prevented movement altogether. When injury or illness reached a point where the servant truly couldn't perform their duties, the household reluctantly shifted into replacement mode. Tasks didn't stop. They simply fell to someone else. A sick chambermaid meant the parlour maid took on twice the load. A footman with a sprained wrist meant his colleague served every dish alone, rushing through hallways with the elegance of someone experiencing slow emotional combustion. The cook losing an assistant meant the entire kitchen moved with desperate urgency, boiling and chopping in synchronized panic. Servants felt guilty for becoming burdens, even when they were barely conscious. No one wanted to be the reason someone else worked harder. No one wanted to provoke the housekeeper's disappointment or the butler's solemn frown. Illness was not just physical suffering. It carried emotional weight. Only in severe cases, illness that left a servant bedridden, delirious, or visibly collapsing, did the household grant real rest? A maid might be allowed to lie down for a few hours or even a day, though this was rare. Someone would bring broth or water. Another servant, usually at the bottom of the hierarchy, was tasked with checking on the patient between her million other duties. But even then, recovery had a time limit. A servant who remained sick too long became a problem, and problems were handled practically. Dismissal was the unspoken threat hanging over every prolonged illness. The manor needed functioning bodies, not fragile ones. A servant with a chronic condition, recurring injury or extended weakness risked losing their position entirely. Employers often claimed it was for their own good, as though releasing someone into poverty with a fever was an act of mercy. Some families offered a small severance. Others sent former servants away with nothing but a handshake and instructions to rest when you can. The cruelty lay not in intent but in structure. The system couldn't afford to carry those who faltered. Some servants hid the injuries to avoid this fate. A groom might continue working with a cracked rib rather than risk losing the job that fed his family. A maid might bind her swollen ankle tightly beneath her stockings and limp through tasks, hoping no one noticed. A footman with a cough learned to time it between rooms so the guests never heard. These acts of survival weren't bravery, they were necessity. Even when servants recovered, illness left them behind in another way. Falling sick meant losing momentum, missing tasks, slipping from favour or appearing unreliable. In households where competition for respect or promotion was fierce, even 1 weak could change a servant's trajectory. Yet despite the harshness, servants supported one another with tremendous compassion. A friend might sneak an herbal remedy from the kitchen. Someone might offer extra blankets or a clean cloth dipped in cool water. A footman might discreetly take on another's lighter tasks. Servants didn't just endure illness, they endured together, quietly resisting a system that allowed no softness from above by providing it below stairs. And the truth was, no matter how brutal the pace, no matter how draining the expectations, servants adapted. They learned which symptoms could be worked through and which required sitting down before someone fainted into the soup tureen. They paced themselves when possible and pushed themselves when not. They found resilience in camaraderie, strength in habit, and stubborn endurance in the knowledge that rest, true rest, would not be granted, but occasionally stolen. Because in a manor, the work never stopped, and so servants learned to survive illness the same way they survived everything else, quietly, efficiently, and in motion. For most servants, the household hierarchy wasn't just a structure, it was a vertical cliff. Intimidating, slippery, and carved from centuries of tradition. Rising in rank was possible in the same way winning the lottery while being struck by lightning was possible. Theoretically, but don't plan your life around it. Still, ambition existed below stairs. Servants dreamed, quietly, cautiously, of higher wages, better rooms, more respect, and perhaps the ultimate fantasy, a job that didn't involve sprinting down hallways with boiling soup. Promotions were the glimmers of hope threaded through long days. They reminded servants that while the system was rigid, it wasn't completely sealed shut. The most common path upward was simply time and competence. A young maid who proved herself reliable, organised and immune to panic might eventually rise to become a senior housemaid, then perhaps assistant to the housekeeper. A scullery maid who survived long enough and demonstrated iron endurance could become a kitchen maid, then a cook's assistant, and after many years of burns, tears and chopping, possibly even the cook herself. Footman had a clearer ladder: junior footman, second footman, first footman, under butler, butler. If the stars aligned, the wines cooperated, and the universe showed mercy. The butler was the highest-ranking male servant in most households, the commander of order and the guardian of keys. Reaching that position meant decades of impeccable service, perfect posture, and the emotional fortitude to withstand countless crises involving spilled gravy, misplaced silver, and demanding guests. Promotions for female staff were equally laden with hurdles. The housekeeper's role was the summit, a position of authority, respect, and enough keys to feel like you owned a small kingdom. A lady's maid also held a prestigious position, but promotion into it required a rare blend of discretion, skill, fashion sense, and the ability to handle your mistress's emotional unravelling without ever appearing shocked or judgmental. Many maids aspired to such roles, knowing they offered better wages and private rooms, luxuries akin to saintly rewards. But ambition wasn't enough. Opportunity depended on vacancy, and vacancies depended on retirement, dismissal, or death. Not exactly a cheerful waiting game. A maid might wait 10 years for a chance to become a lady's maid, only for the mistress to hire someone from outside the manor entirely, because she has such a nice face, don't you think? Beyond availability, servants needed references, glowing, impeccable, and phrased in the delicate language of the upper class. One sentence in a reference letter could make or break a career. She is pleasant and capable was excellent. She tries her best was a polite death sentence. The butler and housekeeper held immense power here, deciding who was worthy of praise and who needed more seasoning, emotionally or professionally. Then there was the unspoken enemy of all career-driven servants, bias. Aristocratic households favoured certain looks, manners, accents, and temperaments. A tall, handsome footman was more likely to be promoted than one of shorter stature, no matter how diligent. A maid who appeared graceful and soft-spoken gained opportunities more readily than one with an unfortunate voice or a tendency to trip over rugs. Merit mattered, but so did optics, an irony not lost on the staff who spent their lives managing the family's public image. Despite these barriers, some servants succeeded spectacularly. There were stories whispered below stairs like legends. The scullery maid who became a celebrated cook known for soufflés that rose like miracles. The once timid chambermaid who grew into a formidable housekeeper, feared by us worldwide. The footman who became a distinguished butler in a prestigious household. The nanny who married into the family after years of raising the children. And then there were the rarest success stories of all. Servants who left service entirely. Some saved enough money to open small businesses, laundries, bakeries, inns, tailoring shops. Others married stable tradesmen and built lives far from the echoing halls of aristocratic estates. These tales were repeated with reverence, proof that the world outside the manor wasn't just a dream but a possible destination. Still, for every triumph, hundreds remained in place. Not because they lacked ambition or skill, but because the system relied on stability. The household functioned smoothly only when its hierarchy remained mostly intact. Promotions disrupted routines. New roles required recalibration. Many masters preferred the comfort of familiar faces performing familiar tasks, and so the ladder remained narrow even when the servants below it grew capable enough to climb. Yet hope persisted. Servants encouraged one another, mentored juniors, and celebrated each small milestone, a new apron signifying advancement, a key handed over, an extra shilling added to wages, or a slightly better room granted. Progress was slow, but each step mattered deeply. In the end, climbing the ladder was less about reaching the top and more about gaining whatever foothold you could. More respect, a lighter workload, a small improvement until in circumstances. For servants, upward mobility wasn't just a career goal, it was a testament to their resilience, endurance, and refusal to accept that their first position must also be their last. Dreams did not die easily below stairs, they adapted. For all its exhaustion, hierarchy, and relentless labour, life in manor service wasn't merely endured. It was chosen by countless people, generation after generation. That choice wasn't always free, but it wasn't senseless either. Manor service offered structure, belonging, pride, and a place in a world where survival depended on knowing your role. The good news, you survived manor service. The bad news, you're now emotionally bonded to the laundry room. To understand why people stayed, you have to imagine a world where alternatives were limited. Rural poverty, seasonal unemployment, tenant farming, unstable trades, these overshadowed the countryside. Service, by contrast, offered certainty. A servant had food, shelter, clothing, and a predictable, if exhausting, routine. In a society where disaster was always one bad harvest away, stability was worth its weight in polished silver. But beyond practicality, there was identity. Being a servant meant belonging to something larger than yourself. A well-run household, a respected estate, a world that operated with ritualistic precision. Servants weren't passive participants. They were the gears of the manor, the invisible force that kept life elegant and effortless upstairs. Many took pride in their invisibility. They could walk into a room and instantly assess what needed doing. They developed instincts sharpened by years of experience. How to smooth drapes, how to build the perfect fit, how to serve tea so silently that guests wondered whether it had levitated onto their tray. And pride mattered. A cook who could produce flawless dishes for a banquet knew her skill rivaled any professional. A butler who managed a household smoothly took pride in a job that required diplomacy, precision, and unwavering control. A lady's maid who saved her mistress from a wardrobe disaster knew she'd prevented social catastrophe. They became experts, professionals in a field that demanded mastery on every level. Then there was community, perhaps the deepest reason people stayed. Life below stairs forged relationships, forged through shared strain, shared humour, and shared silence during the rare quiet moments. Servants worked shoulder to shoulder, suffered the same long hours, and celebrated the same small victories. In a world where the family lived in luxury and servants lived in reality, camaraderie became the glue that held everything together. Dormitories became unofficial support groups. Late-night whispers between beds became therapy sessions. Quick jokes exchanged during chores lifted spirits. A cup of tea quietly shared in the kitchen during a lull felt like rebellion disguised as hospitality. These small bonds accumulated into something powerful, a sense of home. Many servants joined households where their parents, siblings, or even grandparents had worked. Entire families became entwined with the manor's history. For them, service wasn't simply a career, it was a tradition, an inheritance. They knew which families were kind, which masters fair, which estates offered opportunity, and which ones to avoid. Loyalty formed not from obedience, but from familiarity, memory, and bloodline. And when servants left home to enter service, the household became a surrogate family. The butler, strict as he was, often served as a paternal figure. The housekeeper kept order like a stern aunt. Older maids guided younger ones. Footmen mentored each other. Grooms shared techniques with novices learning to manage unpredictable horses. In the absence of privacy, emotional bonds formed naturally. Yet there was also cultural expectation. Society viewed domestic service as respectable, especially for those who lacked land or trade skills. Parents encouraged sons and daughters to enter service because it guaranteed income, discipline, and a moral environment, theoretically. Young people saw it as a step toward adulthood, a chance to learn life skills before marriage or other work. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honourable. For some, service offered something else, freedom wrapped in structure. While duties were rigid, life inside the manor provided shelter from harsher outside realities. Servants encountered new ideas, new fashions, new social behaviours simply by observing the family. A lady's maid might pick up French phrases, a footman might learn polite speech patterns, a cook might master cuisines unknown in her village. Service broadened horizons in ways few other occupations could. Then there was the strange but very real satisfaction of competence. The manor presented challenges, tight schedules, demanding tasks, fickle guests, and servants rose to those challenges. The ability to manage chaos gracefully became its own reward. When the entire staff worked seamlessly during a banquet or holiday, the sense of accomplishment resonated through every corner of the servants' hall. Of course, this life came with trade-offs. Fatigue was constant, privacy was non-existent, ambitions were limited. But many accepted these hardships because they believed in the dignity of their work and the reliability of their world. Service gave rhythm to their days and direction to their futures. It offered a ladder, narrow, slippery, and difficult to climb, yes, but a ladder nonetheless. And perhaps most importantly, servants found meaning in each other. Community softened the hard edges, humour dulled the sting of exhaustion, shared experience bound them tightly. Even decades later, former servants remembered their time below stairs with surprising fondness, not because the work was easy, but because the relationships were unforgettable. In the end, manor service made sense because it offered survival, belonging, purpose, and a kind of structured hope. It shaped identities, shaped lives, and built communities that, though tucked in the shadows of grand houses, were every bit as rich in human complexity as the lives lived upstairs. And if you emerged from it with aching feet, a perfected posture, and the uncanny ability to fold linens with supernatural precision, well, that was just the price of becoming part of a world where every creak of the floorboard told a story, and every servant helped write it.